Yeah. Good evening and welcome. The time is 6 o'clock and I'd like to call to order the January 19th, 2022 Kaiser Planning Commission to order. I feel like I haven't seen you guys since last year. No? Okay. I'm sorry. Debbie's noted the attendance. We've got one commissioner missing tonight. Go ahead and get into consideration and approval of the December regular session minutes. Is there a motion on the minutes?
I move that we approve the minutes as submitted.
Got a motion to approve by Commissioner Grentz and a second by Commissioner Herb. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. Motion passes. Thank you, Debbie, as always. Appearance of interested citizens, we have none. Anybody that you know of that's coming? Great. Our next order of business is a public hearing on the Parks Master Plan update. I will open the public hearing at 6:01. Mr. Witham and Dina, Ms. Horner.
Thank you, Chair Lawyer, Planning Commissioners. I do apologize on behalf of Councilor Johnson. He was going to be given this staff report tonight, but he was unable to be with us. So we have a public hearing tonight for our Parks Master Plan update. It's a process that's been going on for basically the past year. I have not been super involved with it because it really is a function of the Parks Board and our Public Works Department. There has been a lot of outreach, a big public engagement process, and there's actually been meetings at the Parks Board and the master plan as it stands. There were some minor changes, as I understand it, that the Parks Board made. I may ask Chair Lawyer to chime in if he has some things to add, because I know he happens to be a member of our Parks Board. But ultimately, there was a work session with City Council and an initial public hearing with City Council. And it was at that time that City Attorney Shannon Johnson recognized that, technically our Parks Master Plan is a subset of our comp plan. So from a process perspective, we have to come to this body for a recommendation prior to us finalizing the public hearing process with council and adopting it. So unfortunately, it is more of a formality than a substantive issue for Planning Commission to consider, but it's one of those necessary things that we do from a process perspective. So with that, I would be happy to ask any questions. Its staff recommendation is that Planning Commission recommends approval to City Council. And I would invite Chair Lawyer, since he is on the Parks Board and I am not, if he has anything more to add, I would welcome that as just a point of information for everyone.
Yeah, and I think before I do, and I should have asked this question earlier, Debbie, is there any preclusion for me participating in this vote since I've already voted on it? No. Okay. Thank you, Shane. So the Parks Master Plan, as Shane mentioned, has been underway for the last year or so. MIG Consulting came in and did all the work. They've done a really good job of identifying a lot of the current needs and current issues that we have in our park system. I think what's unique about this particular Parks Master Plan as opposed to historical Parks Master Plans is this particular master plan is not just a formality. We actually, because of the parks fee and everything else that exists now that didn't exist in previous iterations, there's a lot more that can actually be done. So it's not so much aspirational as it is real intended goals and consequences of the master plan. Major substantive updates to the master plan are including Kaiser Little League into the master plan. Historically, the Kaiser Little League has not been part of the master plan. And identifying some key areas about funding, about operations and maintenance and things like that that previous iterations may not have had, where they identified some of those issues. Now there's actually mechanisms to take care of those things. So one other major consideration, Palmacia, which is an undeveloped park along the Willamette River. There was language in the original redraft that suggested that the city could actually eliminate Palmacia as a park. And the Parks Board recommended to keep that in the master plan and work with the neighborhood groups to maintain that and to work with that park in an undeveloped capacity, but kind of make it a little more akin to what you see now, like Wallace House, where they've done a bunch of work and it's a little bit more accessible. There's some challenges with Palmacita due to where the Army Corps of Engineers has done their work and things like that. So there's some restrictions, but I think there's still a lot of opportunity. So that's back in the plan. But really, it's going to be a great tool for Robert Johnson and Bill Lawyer to kind of work through the operations and maintenance plan that we had, which was kind of the getting everything back up to speed and getting rid of all the deferred maintenance, and then kind of switching gears towards some new things. And so there's already some really good projects on the horizon. And I would expect that we'll probably, I think typically, what are these, about a 10-year look or so on these? Yes. The other big change is at Kaiser Rapids. So when they did the 2009 amendment to the master plan to bring Kaiser Rapids in, they kind of threw everything at the dartboard to see what would stick in terms of the development at that park. We've refined it a little bit more. We've eliminated some of the sports courts, but we've added multi-use sports courts. And there's some conversations about some different funding opportunities that may come down within the next 18 to 24 months for those particular projects. So we're already looking at some capital investment and some other things that are happening. But that's kind of the 5,000 foot, 500 mile an hour flyby. A lot of really good work went into it. I think so much so that actually the Parks Board didn't have a lot to engage. I mean, MIG did such a great job, and Bill and Robert did such a great job that I think the recommendations are very solid. We have solidified a lot of the things that were aspirational before into more of objective goals moving forward. And, we got the most amazing park staff, and I think we're going to see some great things coming out of it. So if there's questions, please ask them. I'm sure I went kind of quick, but I'm happy to. Yes, sir.
Real quick, you said bringing the Kaiser Little League into the master plan. I assume you mean the Little League fields, the ballpark,
Yes.
the land?
That's correct. Thank you. The actual complex itself. The idea behind that, to provide some context, historically, the complex, Kaiser Little League complex, has been ran by volunteers and things like that, and they've sort of been in charge of their own destiny. But because they were not included in the master plan, it prohibited them from getting state funding and other things that typically come within the park system. So, like, if we wanted to do another big toy project, we can go to Oregon Parks and Rec and apply for grants. Well, the complex was not allowed to do that because it wasn't in the Kaiser Parks master plan. So now that the complex as a park is in the master plan, it opens up a lot more opportunities for them. So the function, that's all done. The council, a few months ago, did the contract for the management of that, but specifically the complex is what we're talking about. Very good clarification, thank you. It's super cool. 10 bonus points to anybody that can tell me how many parks we have. Nobody? Nobody? 19. Yeah.
16.
Yeah. If I got that wrong, Debbie, I just need to quit that board. I've been preaching it for how many years? Unless there's any further questions, anything else from Shane or Dina or Debbie?
No, from our perspective, that's kind of our staff report. Like I said, our recommendation is that Planning Commission recommend approval to City Council, and obviously take any testimony that might want to be there, but I don't see anybody.
Yeah, and I think because it was such a parks-heavy thing, we got some testimony, mostly from West Kaiser Neighborhood Association. All of those recommendations were folded into the recommended plan for council. I think if there were issues, knowing West Kaiser as well as I do, they'd be here addressing them now. So I don't think there's anything else that I would imagine coming from the public. We'll see when it goes to City Council, but from this level, I don't see any more. Commissioner Burson, anything?
No.
No? Commissioner Hutchins? Anything else? Commissioner Herb? No? Commissioner Salvador?
I'm good.
Last attack. All right. Well, I suppose we close the public hearing now. I'll close the public hearing on the Kaiser Parks Master Plan at 6:09, and we will take a motion. Did I do that wrong? Okay, good.
I move that we recommend the council adopt the 2021 Parks and Recreation Master Plan as submitted tonight.
Second.
All right, we have a motion by Commissioner Grants and a second by Commissioner Saldivar to recommend adoption of the 2021 Parks and Recreation Master Plan as submitted tonight. Any further discussion?
I just have a clarifying question. So I know they called it the 21, but is it when it gets approved by the city council? Is it the date or is it?
That's a good clarifying question.
Yeah, I think it's also like the title on the document.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it will be called that, and because it's a 10-year document, it's really the master plan is longer than that.
Okay.
But yeah, if our city attorney was here, he could give a definitive answer to that question. But I do believe it actually is considered a 21 master plan.
Okay.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion passes unanimously with one absent. All right. Super exciting. Now they can finish it. Okay. Next item is new old business staff report, discussion on House Bill 2001, the survey results and code update recommendations. Take it away.
Thank you, Chair Lawyer of Planning Commissioners. So we're back again with more House Bill 2001 stuff. In your packets that we sent you, we kind of provided you with the document from our consultants, Matt Hasty and Brandon Crawford with Angelo Planning Group. They're going to come and talk with us and we'll kind of walk us through a presentation. But basically in the packet, we have a document there that has some gray boxes that has some kind of overview and narrative from our consultant team, and then some actual proposed language changes for specific sections that are needing to be changed. This first rendition is basically, these don't represent kind of the policy consideration things we talked about at last meeting. These are more of the low-hanging fruit, if you will. The, hey, this is mandated, we have to do this kind of stuff. And then the other thing that we've included in the packet was survey results and it's kind of a summary of that, and then also some open-ended response things. So Mr. Hasty and Mr. Crawford are going to kind of walk us through the high-level discussion. And, you know, specifically, just another reminder, it's not a public hearing. You're not making any decisions tonight. Really what we're doing here is more akin to a technical advisory committee. So it really is more about keeping you all informed of, hey, here's where we're at in the process. And then if there's any feedback that you want to provide, concerns, questions, other thoughts, that's great for us because what's in front of us tonight is truly draft. And actually we had a conversation this morning. I was on vacation for a little while. Mr. Hasty was on vacation, so we didn't have time to connect quite as deeply as we would have liked to with this first draft. But the good news with the draft is we still have time to do that. So I'm going to be kind of really going over it with a much finer tooth comb after hearing back from your input that you have tonight, if there is any. And so that when we come back here in a couple more months with actual drafts that we're having public hearings with, all those details can be worked out. So that really is what we're looking for tonight, is just one, to educate y'all where we're at and to kind of keep everybody up to speed on, hey, here's what things are going to start looking like, and then to get that input and feedback from all of you as commissioners so that we know that when we come back next month that we're coming back with the right direction with things. And I think other than that, I will just turn it on over to Mr. Hasty and Mr. Crawford.
All right. Thanks, Shane. Can you guys hear me? Is this guy on? Yeah?
It doesn't.
It doesn't sound like it, but maybe I'm just not close enough. Yeah, it is. Okay. I'll just get even closer. So, I'll just say one more thing kind of to build on what Shane said about kind of the format of what we sent you. We have kind of our own APG format for how we tend to organize these memos and draft them. And so we just went ahead and sort of did it that way. And one of the things we talked to Shane about in advance of this meeting was for the next draft provide it in a format that's a little more like what you guys are used to seeing it in. So this one's a little maybe different or not structured exactly the way you might tend to see proposed code amendments, but the next draft will be. So I'll just kind of put that out there, that the next one will be something more like what you're used to seeing. So with that, I'll start us off on the presentation. Brandon is actually going to do most of the talking tonight, and I'm going to do the note-taking. And then I'll take the first 2 or 3 slides. Brandon will walk us through the majority of the code update language. Towards the end, we will kind of go back and revisit a couple items that we talked about at the previous meeting as policy issues, so detached plexes and ADUs. Before we do that, we'll tell you what you heard via the open house and the survey, because we asked people what they thought about those concepts or ideas. So we'll give you that information. Then we'll see if you have any kind of further recommendations on those things, and then we'll just kind of finish it up with next steps and adjourn. And as Shane said, a lot of what we'll talk to you about in terms of the first batch of amendments really are sort of things that you'll need to do just to meet the fairly, I'll call them straightforward or more cut and dried requirements associated with lot sizes, parking, in some cases, design standards. And we'll give you a sense of where there was a direction we could go or not, kind of why we went a certain direction, particularly where we could kind of tailor this to what you have in your code now, particularly in terms of applying certain design standards to specific types of housing. So Brandon will talk about it as we go through. So just in terms of, where we are in the process, this is our 3rd meeting with you all and kind of reviewing the first batch of amendments. We'll come back in February to review the 2nd batch of amendments. So then we'll combine everything, make refinements based on what we heard tonight, and at the next meeting with a combined, I'll call it kind of pre-final draft set of amendments, review those, get any additional comments you all have, and then come back again for essentially the adoption process. So plenty of opportunities, as Shane said, to talk about this stuff. And I would say as we go through the stuff tonight, just interrupt us and ask us questions if you have questions or comments, and we'll do our best to address them. There were some things you asked us about last time that we said, well, we think we know the answer, but we might need to check in with the folks at the state, at DLCD, and we did that, so we have some more definitive info on a few of those things, and we'll note those things as we go along. So that's kind of where we are now, and let's see, with that, it's time for Brandon to take it away, and I'll take notes, and we'll both answer questions if we can, but mostly Brandon will.
Thank you, Matt. I'll give you a break from talking for a little bit. So I'll just to start out, I'm going to give us a quick high-level overview of what we'll be talking about tonight, just building off of what Matt was just saying. So as Matt already commented, this is just the first phase of our code update recommendations. So included in that first phase, we have some comprehensive plan amendments. Those are fairly minor. It's mostly just...
Hey, Brandon, can I interrupt you? I'm having a really hard time hearing you, so if you can speak up just a little bit more,
Sure.
I apologize.
Let me orient this so I can still see it. All right, is that better?
That is, thank you.
Okay. So, those comp plan amendments are mainly just to clarify that middle housing is allowed in single-family zones, just to support those code updates. So there's consistency between the development code and the comp plan. And then there's also some areas where there's density ranges stated for certain residential zones. So we just wanted to clarify that those density ranges won't apply to middle housing. We added middle housing definitions in the definitions section of the code, just giving a definition for each different type of middle housing, and that helps to distinguish these housing types from multifamily housing, which is what they're previously considered. We made updates to allow middle housing outright in every applicable zone. So in each residential zone section in the code, there's that list of permitted uses. We just added the middle housing types as permitted uses instead of conditional or special use. We updated development standards to meet minimum compliance. So those main updates for that piece were just reducing minimum lot sizes for middle housing types and reducing the off-street parking requirements. And we made some initial recommendations for design standards, and those are fairly straightforward. Right now, we're just mainly recommending that the existing single-family design standards just are applied to middle housing as well. And we also made some other tweaks to the cottage cluster design standards. We made some updates to the approval procedures so that each middle housing type is subject to the same review and approval procedure that is in place for single-family detached. And then like I mentioned, we made some other revisions to the existing cottage cluster section of the code so that it meets the minimum compliance standards. All right, moving on. So we recommended a few comprehensive plan policies just to, like I said, to support middle housing and to ensure consistency with the development code. Specifically, we suggest adding middle housing to the low-density residential policy to clarify that these areas are not exclusively just for single-family. And we also recommended some minor amendments to include middle housing types in the list of the housing that's allowed for the different density ranges. And again, we included an amendment that clarifies that those density ranges won't apply to middle housing types. So fairly minor amendments for the comp plan. Now moving more into the meat of it. So as we pointed out in the audit, the RS zone, the single family zone, is currently the only one that does not permit any middle housing. So each middle housing type will need to be listed as a permitted use in that section. Every other zone currently allows every middle housing type except for cottage clusters. But each of those middle housing types are currently combined with the multifamily category. So we made some minor revisions in those sections just to separate out those middle housing types. And like I mentioned, cottage clusters aren't permitted outright in any of those zones, so those are also added to the permitted list in each residential zone as well. And as we discussed for the audit last time we met, the minimum lot sizes for duplexes can be no greater than the minimum lot size for single family in each zone. So that will be 4,000 square feet for the RS, the RL, and the RM zones. And because single-family lot size is less than 5,000 square feet, triplexes can have a minimum lot size that is no greater than 5,000 square feet in each of those zones. So that's what we're recommending at the moment for those. Likewise, quadplexes and cottage clusters will need to be 7,000 square feet for each of those zones as well, because single-family detached is less than 7,000 square feet. And townhouses will need to be 1,500 square feet for every residential zone. That's kind of independent of what single-family detached lot size is. And we recommend keeping the existing lot width and depth, setback, and height for all middle housing types, except for townhouse. Those lots can have a minimum width no greater than 20 feet, and we recommend that the max height for cottage clusters is 25 feet. We also included a brief amendment to each zone's density provision to state that each middle housing type will be exempt from the existing density maximum. except for townhouses, that's the one exception for the density. They can have a max density of 25 units per acre for each zone.
Any questions on any of that? I think it's kind of pretty straightforward and consistent with the audit, but just want to make sure we can stop it.
So just to comment on the townhouses, the 20-foot lot width is because it's intended to be 0 lot lines, because they're typically going to be connected for townhouses?
So that 20-foot lot width is actually kind of a proxy for the street frontage. The state requires that townhouses can have a lot width or a street frontage, a minimum street frontage that is no greater than 20 feet. So if you make the lot width no greater than 20 feet, you're effectively ensuring that street frontage is also no greater. But it's not, doesn't, well, yes, it also accounts for that 0 lot line, because it's not very practical to construct attached units side by side if they're fairly wide lots, if that makes sense.
Pretty narrow house, but yeah.
And I would just point out that is a minimum that we're applying. So if somebody were to come in for a townhouse development and propose greater than that, they could. But what the state rules, and it's hard, the townhouse rules and the cottage cluster rules are in House Bill 2001, they're really prescriptive.
Yeah.
Like the other rules where you have to allow all the types says, hey, you can't require more of these than you do for a single family. But then the townhouse section and the cottage cluster section, the state kind of went deeper and said, in addition, you have to do this, this, and this. So that 20-foot minimum width in our minds, and I felt like Brandon, Matt, it totally made sense. It tracked in my mind at least that, yeah, make the minimum width 20 feet because we can't make the minimum frontage greater than 20 feet anyway. So it kind of sets it aligns it. So it just makes it, I think, an easier usable tool for a developer or a homeowner to come in and go, oh, okay, that's what my lot needs to look like. But if they chose to say, hey, that's too narrow for my townhouse, I need 30 feet, they can still do that.
Okay. Commissioner Grants?
What was the driver behind the 25-foot height limit for cottage clusters?
So that is based on the model code design standards for cottage clusters. So we just borrowed from that, and the city could choose to make it higher, but since cottages tend to be fairly small units and they probably won't be developed at greater heights than that, we figured 25 feet seems logical, but if the city's interested in making them higher, they can do that.
Yeah, it's sort of, you're kind of trading like density for size, because cottage clusters can be developed at higher densities because of the minimum lot sizes and the number of cottages you can have. So the idea behind cottage clusters is that they tend to be smaller units. There's more of them on a piece of property, but they're smaller. And so 25 feet is pretty typical standard for cottage clusters, where there are cottage cluster standards around the state. And that's also, as Brandon said, what's in the model code, which is kind of now embedded through the state as, oh, these are fine. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so, oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah, I'll pass this over. We'll swap or something. So yeah, we basically borrowed that from the model code, and it's, again, kind of because you can have more, they're intended as a housing type to be kind of these smaller units, potentially lower cost to build given the size. They've got a smaller footprint standard as well than a typical single family detached home. So does that help?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And one other thing I would add, they also have a different standard for setbacks to the perimeters of property for cottage clusters that are prescriptive in the model code. So I believe they can actually be a little closer than what our current rear yard setbacks would be for a single family home, for example. Because isn't it a 10 foot is the maximum?
10 foot perimeter setback. So that would be kind of side and rear lot lines. So that's the other thing. Yeah, if you kind of got them a little tighter, then it's nice to have some transition in height. Yeah.
Is this on? Okay. Can you guys hear me at this distance?
It's still pretty quiet, but
Okay.
I'm a little hard of hearing, so I apologize.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah.
I can hear myself at least, so it's an improvement. Any further questions? Okay, I'm gonna keep moving forward. So we'll talk a little bit about the high density zone, the RH zone. So the RH zone already mostly complies. It allows all middle housing types outright, except for cottage clusters. So cottage clusters will also need to be removed from the list of special permitted uses and just shifted to the permitted outright uses. Actually, I'm sorry, correction. It doesn't even need to be moved to that section because in the code, it just says all residential uses are allowed. So implicitly, that'll include cottage clusters. So for lot width, depth, and setbacks, those will remain the same for all housing types, except lot size for townhouses will need to be reduced to 1,500 square feet, which is the same for every zone. And for the mixed use zone, this is basically the same as the RH zone. All housing types are already allowed outright, again, except for cottage clusters. So that one will also just need to be removed from the special and conditional uses, and it'll implicitly be allowed. So this zone allows for smaller lot sizes for single family at 4,000 square feet. So duplexes will also need to be 4,000, triplexes at 5,000 square feet, and the city currently allows quadplexes or multifamily at 6,000 square feet. So we'll just keep that the same for quadplexes and for cottage clusters at 6,000 square feet. We recommend duplexes
I'm
and
sorry,
triplexes.
I thought earlier you said that quadplexes would be at 7,000
Right.
square feet.
Right, that was for the RS, the RL, and the RM zone. And for the high density zone, we're just recommending 6,000 square feet because that's currently what the lot size, minimum lot requirement is for quadplexes and multifamily. That's the minimum lot size for all residential in that zone.
Thank you.
So we kind of figured it doesn't make sense to really go bigger or go the other way, if that makes sense. Let's see, where was I? So we recommend duplexes and triplexes have the same existing lot width and depth that applies to single family, which is 40 feet and 70 feet respectively. And we recommend that quadplexes and cottage clusters also keep the same lot width and depth that is required for multifamily for those zones. And all middle housing types will also have the same setbacks required for single family, which are the same setbacks and standards that apply for the RS, RL, and RM zones. And then the River Cherry Overlay District, we'll have to update every housing type there, or every middle housing type, and I'll discuss that here on this slide. So for the RCOD zone, the dimensional standards for each housing type somewhat varies based on what the underlying zone is. So we've simply...
I had another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry to make you back out,
Yep.
but, so my question is that this amount of square footage to be able to put, say, a duplex or a triplex on, if there's already a house there, does that have to be remaining square footage on the lot? Or is the total lot can be, say, 6,000 square feet, have a house on it, and be able to put a quadplex on that?
So it would be,
mean,
so basically.
theoretically,
Yeah, no, so what it would mean is that there's two provisions, and one of them is kind of a policy consideration that we're going to be looking to you for, and that's whether or not we're going to allow what we would call detached plexes. But if you had a 6,000 or in an RS zone, a 7,000 square foot lot, I own a house on O'Neill Road. It's a 7,200 square foot lot. It's got a 1,500 square foot house on it. If I wanted to convert that to a fourplex, theoretically with this code, I would be able to do that.
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to have a fourplex and a single family home. It's an either or. Now, if, as a policy consideration, if planning commission moves to say we would allow detached plexes, and so you could have 4 individual units that would be considered a quadplex, then in my specific property that I own, my single family home that sits there, if I could fit it and meet setbacks, I could theoretically add 3 more structures and call it a fourplex. I mean, physically it would be like impossible with my property, but that's what we're talking about. So I think what you would see most likely in the real world is you'd see redevelopment happening. So somebody would either modify an existing structure or bulldoze it and build something brand new.
Okay, but, so on your example then, with your 1,500 square foot home on a 7,000 square foot, you could put a duplex on that because there's 4,000 square feet left.
Sure.
And still leave your home.
No. Well, unless,
You would call that a triplex then? Okay.
that kind of speaks into that detached plexes versus kind of the standard definition of what a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex is, which would be 1 building with 3 units versus 3 buildings with 1 unit each.
Okay, thank you.
Or a mix of types. Does that help?
Yep, it does, thank you.
And I would just add, it's not so much about like how much of the lot's left after you kind of subtract out a certain amount of area for the existing house. It's just, what's the total size of the lot? How many units in a plex are allowed there within that zone? So whether it's a conversion or if you decide to allow those detached plexes, adding some structures in that way, it's just number of units is governed by the total size of that existing lot.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
All right, and we'll touch on that a little bit more once we talk about the conversions, middle housing conversions recommendations. So, where was I? Oh, the River Cherry Overlay District. So, as I was saying, the dimensional standards vary based on the underlying zone within that overlay district. So we've simply combined duplex with the existing single-family standards and reduced townhouses to 1,500 square feet and 20 feet lot width. We've added new columns for the triplex and quadplex, which have the same dimensional standards regardless of the underlying zone. And these are the only residential development standards in this overlay district that will differ from the underlying zone. And therefore, these are the only ones that will need to be changed. The city will have other amendments that will apply to this zone, such as density and parking, but that applies to all zones, so that's not specific to River Cherry. And so moving on to minimum off-street parking standards.
Brandon, 1 second. Commissioner
Sure.
Grants?
So I'm curious, in the River Cherry Overlay District, where we're wanting to get higher densities, we have a higher minimum lot size for quadplexes than in the standard mixed-use zone?
Yes, that is correct. So as Shane and Matt explained earlier, that for this first draft, we've gone complete minimum compliance approach. So for this zone, you don't have to allow minimum lot sizes to be lower than 7,000. So we're just sticking with 7,000, but you could go lower for quadplexes and cottage clusters if there's interest in that.
Yeah, so this is one where you definitely, you can make a change to what we're suggesting here. You couldn't go with the higher one, but you could go with the lower one. And that, I think, you know, as you're saying, like that might be more consistent with the intent of the zone. So, you know, if you have thoughts about that, we'd be interested in hearing it. But for now, we kind of stuck with, okay, here's what we need to do. That's what we're going to start out suggesting or including and see what you think.
off-street parking. So the off-street parking will need to be reduced to basically one space per unit for most cases. So the number of spaces for triplexes and quadplexes is based on the lot size in the zone. So the city can only require 4 spaces for quadplexes if the lot size is greater than 7,000 square feet. So that's the case for most zones. But because the minimum lot size is 6,000 square feet in the high density and the mixed use zone, the city can only allow up to 3 spaces. So the state requires lot sizes between 5,000 and 7,000 square feet can only have minimum off-street parking of up to 3 spaces for.
And just clarification, you can only require that number.
Right.
You can allow more. So.
Yep. So that's a pretty important clarification, and in a lot of cases, developers probably will provide more than that because generally there's market demand for at least 1 space per unit. And last time we talked about parking, it was mentioned that the city currently does not allow garages to count toward minimum parking. However, as the state does allow cities to count garages towards off-street parking, and I believe as Shane described last time, if the city chooses to allow garages towards off-street parking requirements, that will probably provide some extra flexibility and also maybe provide some additional parking due to the setback standards for the garages providing that extra driveway space. So that's something to consider. Any questions on or comments on parking?
Well, I think maybe the confusion was, I think last time we were hearing that you could only allow 3 spaces. I think maybe that's why the parking thing got brought up for the garages, because, you know, if you got a 2-car garage, then really you have a driveway that could only allow a car, right? But
Yeah.
since you can only require 3, to me, it doesn't seem like as much of an issue with the garages being a parking space.
No, I mean, it really wouldn't. The one thing where it could come into play, so I'll give a real world example of a 4-plex. The way the code is structured on the minimum compliance standards, it says 4 off-street parking spaces is the maximum we can require because there's 4 dwellings in most cases, other than that MU zone or the RH zone. So you build a 4-plex, you're going to provide 4 spaces. Currently, the way my code is written, the city's code is written, those 4 spaces could not be in a garage.
Okay.
If we allowed garages as a policy objective to say garages count as a space, then you could effectively build a 4-plex with a 2-car garage and a 2-car driveway, and that's 4 spaces. And that would meet the minimum if you did that. So it would effectively reduce those numbers of parking in that 4-plex example. A duplex, you could build a 1-car garage, 1 space, and the driveway to get to it is the 2nd space. That would meet the minimum standard if garages were allowed as required minimum parking. Currently, the code does not allow that, only in the case of multifamily. So in multifamily, with these new definitions, and this gets a little bit weird because historically we've always called multifamily basically 3 or more attached units. But with these new definitions, multifamily is going to be defined as 5 or more. So it's truly apartment complexes or small apartment complexes. So in those cases, we've actually had, of course, we had a lot higher parking standard because it was 2 per dwelling unit at a minimum. So you'd have a triplex come in, they maybe build a 3-car garage and have 3 spaces out front, and they could meet our minimum standard for that triplex. Because we used to allow, or we currently allow multifamily to count garages towards parking. That makes sense, or did I just confuse it even more?
So,
Yes. Commissioner Burson.
So, I know we're not making decisions tonight, but this minimum of 6,000 in the, what is it? RH and MU for quadplexes, is that, I mean, is that what's set? It has to, the minimum we can have is 6,000? Or can we make the decision, make it 7? Because if you made it 7, then they have to have 4 places. I mean, again,
You could
I'm really
make it,
scared of becoming, like I said, you know, like Portland, we're building places for people to live with no place to put their car. And so if you're gonna build a quadplex, there's at least 4 cars in that quadplex. And but underneath this, they can only have 3, or they can have a minimum of 3 spaces. Like you said, maybe the market in Kaiser is that they're not gonna buy it unless they have a parking place.
So you could increase it. So right now, essentially, you're allowing a quadplex to be built on a 6,000 square foot lot because of how you define the lot size for multifamily. So you could make it 7,000 in those 2 zones. That would be increasing it compared to what you have now. And so that's why we stuck with 6, because it's actually consistent with your current standard for a quadplex.
But that would require them to actually have 4 spaces, and then if we decided to make a garage be a space, that's where the
True.
flexibility.
I mean,
would
yeah, if you were to bump it up to 7, then you can require 4 parking spaces instead of 3.
come. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then
So
it would
that
be
is a trade-off.
consistent at 7,000 across all the zones.
That is
At
correct.
7,000.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and same thing with cottage clusters. That could be a 7,000 square foot minimum lot size across the zones too.
Thank you.
but for cottage clusters, in terms of parking, that's still just 1 space per unit regardless of how big the lot size is, so.
That's, like I say, we're not making decisions tonight, but I mean, you can tell that's where I'm trying to get to. I mean, you need to have at least 1 space for every living unit. And I mean,
Yeah.
it feels like a minimum in the community that I live in anyway.
Yeah, so, I mean, do other folks think that's a good idea to bump that?
Yeah, I mean,
minimum lot size up?
I think there's some logic and consistency, right?
And it's frankly, I mean, I'll say, it's not
Jeremy
a
wants to bring it
big,
down.
it's not a big increase in lot size, and it's not a like small decrease in density.
Right.
You still allow essentially multifamily at somewhat higher densities in those zones, so.
Yeah, but the that 1 extra parking space, I think,
That makes a difference.
it does, yeah.
Commissioner Grants?
I would consider increasing that to 7,000 and then in the RCOD, flipping that to 6.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that characteristic fits the RCOD model and intent of the RCOD may be better. I mean, I think if we're thinking about what we've seen down by Sonic and maybe some of the aspirational things. Shane, go ahead.
And I would add, like, and then I think this is great, like, honestly, this is great feedback that I'm hearing, because you're bringing up some things that, oh, yeah, I hadn't really thought of that way. So this is exactly what we're wanting for the feedback loop, for us to kind of go back and massage things. And one thing I would kind of ask, and I think I'm hearing it, but I'm feeling like there's a bit of a consensus in the Planning Commission's perspective that 1 space per unit is the more important element than maybe the lot size is. So I would say, you know, that gives me good information. I think that gives Brandon and Matt good information for us to kind of put our heads together and figure out, okay, if we know that's an important element, that we get to that point, let us kind of look at that and go, okay, what are some options? Just, you know, I mean, I don't think we have to have an answer tonight, but I do think that's one thing. What I would say, just to frame it a little bit, when we looked at the RCOD and we went through the revitalization project, it was clearly to increase densities and to allow more flexibilities. Included in that was some parking reduction in that area, right? We dropped our parking from the required 2 spaces per unit down to 1. And so there were some different trade-offs we made in that RCOD. And so now it's sort of like we're applying some of those RCOD changes citywide. So I think it is important for us to hear from you on kind of where your levels of priority and feelings are in relation to, you know, there's density is over here kind of in this basket, but parking is in this different basket now. So before, while we were increasing densities, we weren't changing things to setbacks, we weren't changing things to parking, we weren't changing things to heights or anything like that. So, I mean, I think what I'm hearing is parking is definitely one, and then that I'm not feeling that anybody's really interested in saying, hey, let's go even below the state minimums of parking because of, and I would say that's consistent with all the land use applications I've ever processed here. That's the way the community is. So I think that gives us enough info to kind of think that through and try to work out, okay, what's the option to accomplish that, whether or not we drop the lot size or we don't. And I think Commissioner Grenz, I appreciate your point to the RCOD zone and that was intended as a higher density area. So if we're kind of upping density allowances throughout the city everywhere, and then you're going backwards in the RCOD, that's closer to the transit streets, it's closer to the commercial core, that doesn't make as much sense to me. So I think that does make a lot of sense, and I would guess that might be showing up in the next draft, so.
But I'd also say even in that River Cherry district or whatever, that odd car that doesn't have a place to park is gonna be somewhere in those streets. And so my question to everyone is where in the streets are they going? So if we put it down to 6,000, you build a fourplex, there's 3 parking places, where's the other car going?
Right, and I think that's
And
where.
that's a minimum, most
Yeah.
people have more than one vehicle, so.
Yeah,
Anyway.
no, and it is a minimum, and I would just offer this. So I sit on an advisory committee for climate-friendly and equitable communities. It's a state rulemaking process on transportation planning rules. Actually, I have a meeting tomorrow, and there's a giant packet. It's always great fun. But there are some moves at the state level to even further regulate parking at the state level, to kind of eliminate in future years cities' abilities to regulate minimum parking and essentially let the market forces drive it. And the one thing I would want to just remind planning commissioners from a practical matter, we're specifically talking about the RH and the MU zone. Currently in the city of Kaiser, there are this many properties that are zoned RH. So it's a zone that we have, it's on the books. The consultant actually asked me, should we eliminate this completely? And I said, no, I think it's an important tool for us to have if there are future rezones that were gonna be proposed by a developer or something. But the mixed use zone is the River Road corridor. So you're talking about properties that front on primarily, almost exclusively, not 100% exclusively, but tend to front on arterial and collector streets, which don't allow parking on the street. So it truly will be somewhat of a market factor on what a developer or a property owner is gonna choose to do with that property so that they can actually rent the units out or sell the property to someone. So it's not, as a reminder, we're not talking about properties that are generally right in the midst of a neighborhood, because the mixed use zone is the line of River Road and Area C of Kaiser Station, which is subject to a master plan anyway. So just to kind of put that into frame of reference.
We just saw signs go up though, right there at McNary on River Road, so.
Yeah.
That land is being sold right now. And
Correct, and that land cannot be developed with just single-family homes or middle housing because it's subject to master planning requirements and it's in the RCOD. And it has to have a mix of commercial and residential uses. I think it's a 35-65 split is what the code says. So that's a little, but you're right, the Isle of Bay property just got listed, AJ just listed it right after Christmas. And that's again, that's going to be a piece where you're going to have a bigger development come in. I think where you'd see somebody take advantage of the quadplex is a small piece of property that they're not going to be able to redevelop with a different type of use. So just for what it's worth, I'm not sure that there's that one parking space in that specific criteria of within the RCOD, within the MU zone. It's not ideal, but I don't know that it's as big of a deal. I just want to make sure everybody understands that's not going to be like a city-wide kind of effect like it would in the RS or the RM zones. Right. So,
Commissioner Saldivar.
I just wanted to ask a question. How often do you see plans where someone would propose a quadplex or triplex where they're not providing at least one parking space per unit?
I haven't seen many of them, but to be fair, we don't see a lot of quadplex development in Kaiser. We see duplexes on corners, in certain residential developments. We see mostly single-family residence because that's what our market tends to drive here, or we see multifamily, because I think there's a little bit bigger return on investment for developers generally. So I don't have I mean, I've been here 20 years and I can think of a couple quads that we've approved in the time I've been here. So,
I suspected that I didn't want us to get bogged down in the weeds.
Yeah.
It's something that is a small fraction of what we do here in Kaiser in
Sure.
general. That's just something to
Yeah.
think about. I know as we go through this, each piece, we're like, boom, we gotta
Yeah.
do it, but there's some things that are
Sure.
just bigger and some are a little smaller.
Yeah, but I also don't want to take a passive look at it either.
Absolutely not.
Yeah,
No,
I mean, I
this is-
think we have to be really thoughtful about it, and your point's well taken. It's not a huge demand, but I think if we take a passive look at it and just kind of go, it's not going to happen.
No.
Well, when it does happen, we're all going to go, what the heck happened?
right.
Yeah. And
Right?
No,
mean,
I agree.
yeah.
No, this is the point of our conversation here.
Yeah. No, well, I think it's a good point.
And I'll just say, I haven't seen what's been proposed for development in terms of flexes
Uh-oh, hot mic.
Magnetic.
in Kaiser, but.
So Brandon, try shutting yours off while Matt's talking. That might help.
No, I can control it.
Okay, never mind.
But yeah, in other cities, unless it's a conversion, of like an old house and they kind of split up that old house into a triplex or a quadplex. But if it's a new development of a triplex or a quadplex, it typically ends up looking a lot like a row house. And the spaces, they've got at least one parking space in a driveway right in front of each individual unit. That's, I think, kind of the most common way I see those kind of plexes develop. So I would say that it'd be unusual to see a triplex or a quadplex develop with with less than one space per unit. Not that somebody couldn't do it, and I agree, you do want to think about this, but I would say the most typical development form looks something like that in the places I see it. And I don't mean Portland, I mean like the Dalles or Corvallis or, places kind of outside of the Portland metro area.
So I want to circle back. One of the questions that got brought up as a policy recommendation might be whether or not we want to include a garage as a parking space. It sounds like that may provide more flexibility.
No, it's not, do it.
It would provide, in my opinion, it would provide less guaranteed parking.
Okay.
And I think my recommendation is if parking is a major concern of the Planning Commission, that's probably not a policy consideration you guys want to entertain.
Okay.
Because ultimately for that developer who's looking to kind of skirt it or to do the bare minimum, it will exasperate could exasperate the parking situation if that's the concern.
Got it.
So that would just be that's as blunt as I can put it, so.
And then the other piece was, I think Commissioner Grants had the recommendation of making it 7,000 or I think actually might have been Commissioner Burson, 7,000 for both the RS and RH zones. And then Commissioner Grants's recommendation was actually dropping the RCOD down to 6,000. Is there any?
No, I wanted to comment on your previous about the parking. in the
Okay, go
garage.
ahead, yeah.
So if we keep it, and it's currently right now where we don't include garages as a parking spot. So if we keep it that way, we're not changing anything.
Right.
And a developer could build a quad or triplex with no garage, they have one spot per unit. If they add a garage, then it's two spots.
Right.
That they
Yep.
end up getting, because you have to have 20-foot setback, and that's a spot in front of the garage. So
Yep.
we get a lot of parking if we do that. So, I mean, and there's still flexibility for a developer,
Right.
because they could make a triplex or quad with no garage on the really small spaces, and there would be one spot
Right.
still.
Yeah. Additional thoughts, any other directions on the minimum lot sizes for RS and the other RH? No.
It was
RH
RH,
and
NU,
MU.
and the RCO.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think what Commissioner Grants is saying makes sense because with the spirit of the RCOD being higher density,
Right,
6,000 makes more sense than currently 7, and then the opposite
right.
on this. But I I can also see keeping all 7,000 everywhere.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate Commissioner Burton's observation on that, and I think that my inclination, it sounds like everybody else's, go ahead.
I would only say, since we don't have an RH and that provides flexibility for future zoning, that we would leave the RH just like the RCOD project, zoned area. We don't have one now, and then we're not, the only way we would do one is if we wanted that area to be a high-density place like the RCOD is now. So if we take it away, we're handcuffing future development. 30 years from now, we'd have to make a change if we wanted to create something like that, where we have the tool already to apply a zoning if we were to add more urban growth boundary and have a different zone and say this is this for the RH, we could then have the 6,000. That would be my only thing, because right now we're not changing anything. We don't even have a zone, so no one could apply it there's no way someone could apply that without a zone at this juncture. We're only hurting ourselves, potentially, if we change that away. But
I think if we were to establish an RH zone in the future, we could always revisit this, right?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, obviously, the text amendment process is there for us. What we're dealing with is minimum compliance standards of House Bill 2001, and if the city wanted to modify those further and reduce standards below the minimums, you always would be able to do that. I think so I've heard a couple of things, and I think it's good. I think it gives us a lot to ruminate on and to think about a little bit. And for me personally, to do a little bit more in-depth analysis and look at some maps and some kind of real-world examples. So what I think at this point, I think that I'm hearing where you guys are at. And if you guys want to give really solid direction at a consensus level, although I'm not sure if we quite have it, if everybody's on the same page, but, I'm pretty comfortable with us kind of revisiting, refining the draft so that when we come back in a couple months with the draft, we can circle back on this and we can kind of give you some more information that goes along with it. And ultimately, Shane will say, hey, this is where I landed on my recommendation and these are the reasons why. And then at that point, you guys are planning commission. So if you say, you know what, we want to go this route, let's change it. You give us that direction, we change it before we get to the adoption stage.
So given what Commissioner Saldivar said, I think his point is well taken. I mean, is there any opposition to leaving that at the 6,000, going to 6,000 for the ROCD, and then the others remain at 7,000 or get bumped up to 7,000? Commissioner Bursch, is that?
I still think it ought to be at 7,000 because that requires the 4 spots. So, and, I think inside Cherry and River Road, you're going to have that anyway.
Right.
I think you're going to have a 7,000, square foot lot. So, you have examples of less than 7,000 asking, for a quadplex in there? No.
No. I don't have examples
or really
of
much
bigger than 7,000 asking for quadplex in there.
Yeah. So, I guess I don't mean to be hard about this, but I'd be willing to listen, I guess. We can come back with a recommendation later. I don't think the, 10 by 100 to add to a lot is that much, that much to add. And we get another parking place. And then, like I said, and then if we don't allow garages, now we know that every one of those is built has got at least 2 parking places. And as we know, we all tend to use our garages for other than cars. So,
I feel targeted in that statement there.
No, I
got a ping pong
my
table.
wife and I have been looking at houses lately, and yeah, it's funny how they'll stage the house. You open the garage door up, and yeah, that's where all the junk's at. So it's not near as pretty as the garage, but anyway,
Yeah.
but we're all guilty of that.
All right. I think we got some, at least, ideas for y'all to look at.
I'm comfortable with the feedback that we've gotten with coming back to something and I'll just put the caveat out there. If when we come back with something, you guys hate it, don't hold it against me personally. Because it's all, but I think that I feel like I've heard the vibe of where you guys are landing on some of these things. And I think that's super helpful. That's going to be really good going forward.
Great. All right, John, moving forward.
All right, can you hear me now? Oh, there we go.
yeah, I think that's good information for us to put together some new recommendations or revise what we have right so far. So moving on. So let's talk about design standards. So as we discussed in the audit, the city can't require design standards for middle housing types that are either more restrictive than what's required for single family or more restrictive than what has been established in the middle housing model code. So the simplest path here is we're recommending just requiring the existing single family design standards for middle housing. So that's the simplest option, and it will also just help ensure that middle housing development is generally compatible in character and in style with existing single family areas and with future single family development. So you can see here the existing single family design standards requires homes to incorporate 5 design features from this list of 11 here that's listed up here. The only one that we aren't necessarily totally sure about yet is the city's Cottage Cluster section. So that section also has some separate design standards. So we recommend keeping a lot of those design standards so you don't have to change that Cottage Cluster section all that much, and just revising certain pieces of it so that those standards aren't more restrictive than what's in the model code. So any questions on design standards?
And I'll also note, just to confuse you all, we put a list and then a totally different graphic so that they don't go together. So sorry about that. It's sort of, they're analogous, but they're not the same.
I say yeah, they don't match. But
No, they don't match.
Commissioner Silver.
Yeah, but that is something, I think you guys probably have if you don't already have a graphic that sort of shows some of those elements, then I think we could provide those as part of the code update.
Yeah.
We do not have one, so that would be excellent.
I don't know what
So that's something we could work on.
This list is, we have to pick 5 of these, is that? If we don't already have 5, we have to have a minimum of 5 from this list.
Correct, and that's what we apply to any new single-family home that gets built for,
What are,
Yeah, this is our.
this is our list, right?
This is
Okay,
already in our
that's what
code.
I was
Yeah,
confused
that's your
about.
list.
correct, this is already in our code, and generally,
Yep.
standard residential home construction, they don't have problems meeting it. I think maybe a lot of homes built maybe back in the 80s, they might have had a little more trouble building them to meet our standards exactly, but really modern construction practices, I don't know that, I mean, we maybe have had a couple times where we've had to talk to a builder and say, hey, you need to increase the size of your windows a little bit, or you need to, add a covered porch or something like that. But for the most part, people don't, it's not a big deal for folks to meet the design standards.
This was your test to see if we read this though, right? To see the
Yeah,
numbers
see
that
if
match the
you recognize that we got letters on the graphic.
Yeah, to see if we were paying
On the
attention,
list.
we actually read it.
We stole the graphic from the model code because it's sort of analogous, but yeah.
Well, to be fair, we just got the slides tonight, so.
Well, so, yeah, I still, it's like a pop quiz,
No, that's, I think visuals are super helpful.
So what's number 5? I'm sorry.
Cupolas,
I Googled it, hang on.
thing that kind of sticks up over the roof. It's like
I think it's the guy that directed The Godfather.
Yes,
Yeah.
Francis Ford.
Nice.
We have a little architectural dictionary in my office that sometimes we have to pull out and look at and go, what is that thing? I don't know. And so I have to Google it myself.
kind of like
so.
little tower or a turret.
So it's not like a horse head on the front of a house. right?
No.
I'm going down the,
And I would say
No.
this, like, I will blame my predecessor. This list right here was Nate Brown's deal, who
Nate
was
Brown.
kind of he minored in landscape architecture and fancied himself a designer. So he always used lots of fancy architecture words that I'm like, what is that? And he would have to tell me. So, that was really? Oh, man. So, anyway.
yeah, Uncle Nate always had really great things. I like to call him Uncle Nate because he usually gave me the uncle look when I said something stupid, which was a lot, so.
Nice.
So I digress. Carry on, gentlemen.
Okay, so we will continue moving forward here. So the city will also need to allow conversions of single family to any middle housing type. So we recommend adding these guidelines and requirements for those conversions to the existing single family design section of the code. And we recommend that the city require converted housing type is allowed in the underlying zone. So in other words, this will ensure that conversions can only take place in zones that are subject to HB 2001. And we suggest a requirement that the conversion does not create a non-conforming situation or does not increase non-conformance. So for instance, if your proposed added additional unit goes beyond the setback standard, that wouldn't be allowed. So the exception to the non-conforming piece, though, is minimum parking. So the state requires that cities can't require additional parking spots for a middle housing conversion. However, again, similar to other minimum parking standards, a developer could provide that extra parking if they wanted to, just the city can't require it. And then another piece is the city can't require additional design features for a middle housing conversion. Again, of course, the developer could provide additional design features, just the city can't require it because the state considers that to potentially be a barrier to conversions. So any questions or comments on conversions? Okay, moving on. So the city currently has a pretty extensive cottage cluster section. So we recommend making some revisions to this section just to comply with HB 2001 so that the city can best retain the existing standards to the greatest possible extent. The city will need to remove the requirement that each cottage includes a front porch, and that's simply because front porches aren't exactly required or necessarily required for single family. So, and they're also not a requirement in the model code, so the city can't require that for each cottage unit. And also the option for attached cottages also needs to be removed because the state specifically defines cottage clusters as detached units. So by defining them as attached as well, technically wouldn't comply with the state's definition for cottage clusters. The city also needs to require a minimum density of 4 units per acre. And the city can also set a maximum number of units as well, as long as the max is no less than 8. So the minimum maximum could be 8 units. So with that, we recommend a maximum of 8 units, but if the city wanted to, you could increase that maximum or apply no maximum to the number of units.
And that's the number per cluster. And I think, what have we identified now? Have we identified a maximum number of clusters?
No.
So
we haven't
that's sort of a
specified.
choice for you too, is you could allow more than 8 cottages in a cluster. We're, for now, sticking with the minimum compliance number, which is 8. But you could allow more. You could limit the number of clusters within a cottage cluster development to just a single cluster, or you can allow multiple clusters, or you could cap it at some other number. So that's kind of a little bit of a policy option there as well. And, you know, whether or not, one, I'll say that there's not a ton of cottage cluster developments out there. So this is sort of, I don't know how likely it is that you're going to get like a development that's got multiple clusters. You're going to need a pretty big lot to be able to do that. So it's probably not something you're going to see too often. But you could choose to limit the number of clusters within a cottage cluster development, and or you could allow more cottages in a single cluster. So those are some things to think about. I don't know that we're not necessarily asking for feedback on that, but if you have thoughts on that, we'd be interested to hear it. And the one other thing I'll just note is that the minimum density of 4 units per acre is kind of weird, right? Because if you allow a cottage cluster on a 7,000 square foot lot, the density is going to be a lot higher than 4 units per acre. The 4 units per acre as a minimum is simply because that's the way, for whatever reason, HB 2001 defined a cottage cluster. So we're just being consistent with the statewide definition of a cottage cluster by including that minimum density, even though it's a little silly. I mean, in terms of what the reality is going to be for most cottage clusters, if they get developed. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, because I think I saw at least one person when we noted the 4 per acre go, that looks strange. I don't know who it was, but.
There's a lot of green space in between the clusters, right?
Yeah,
Before
yeah,
1 acre,
yeah.
yeah.
But I think that's kind of intended, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you definitely are, yeah, you want green space.
Yeah.
You know, that's the other sort of defining characteristic of a cottage cluster, or the main one, is that the cottages are oriented around this green space, common area. So I am sorry to take you down too much of a rabbit hole there, but I just wanted to kind of clarify some of that.
Yeah, so does anybody have any initial thoughts on that policy option of number of clusters or units?
What are the odds that we'll get much of this in town?
So we've had cottage clusters on the books since, I believe, 2013, Matt, is that right? You guys
like
helped
that,
us
yeah.
create that section, I
Yeah.
think, after our housing needs analysis back then, I
Yeah.
think. So we've never done a cottage cluster since then. I've had 3 or 4 developers very intrigued with it. One of the things previously is we really didn't give much of a bonus for densities or anything like that. And so the couple of properties that really were interested in it, they both ended up going with just a standard subdivision. And just as an aside, that it is funny to me that the state landed on a 4 units per acre minimum density, because that's our minimum density for residential subdivisions. Like, I mean, that's 5,000, 6,000, 4,000 square foot lots hit that density and above all the time. So it is a very non-dense cottage cluster standard that they adopted as a minimum. But I think the one thing to remember for us in Kaiser is we are somewhat of, I won't say a unique community, but I think there are a lot of communities around the state that have still large tracts of undeveloped land. And so a lot of these changes that we have to adopt may not be as practical in Kaiser, and I think the cottage clusters is probably one of them. However, I can think off the top of my head of a handful of properties where maybe you have somebody that has a big 1/3 of an acre, half-acre parcel, and they don't really want to divide it up, but they might take advantage of this and go, hey, I'll build some cottage clusters back there and get some rental income and do something like that. I think it could be utilized in some cases. I think it's going to just really depend on that property owner's desire of what they personally want to do. So if that's helpful. So.
Yeah, they're kind of, I think of cottage clusters as a little bit of like a niche form of development.
For sure.
And the folks who tend to develop them and want to live in them have a very specific thing they're trying to achieve. They're like very kind of community oriented. Like they want to live in this community of people, or they want to develop something for that purpose. And so I think that, among other things, is why you don't see a ton of them. They're not like a big percentage of the market. So I wouldn't say you won't see any, but I think you won't see a ton.
Yeah.
Just for that reason alone. I think the other thing in your existing or current code that made it a barrier was just the minimum lot size for a cottage cluster.
Yep.
Made it so like most of the lots you got, you couldn't have developed one on it. So
Yeah, I think it was 30,000 square feet is what our
Exactly, and
current
that's pretty
standard is
big
to do a
minimum.
cottage cluster. So you had to have a really big lot, and normally if you have that big of a lot, the return on investment, divide that into separate parcels and sell them,
Exactly.
and they're going to make more money.
yeah,
So.
yeah, and there's going to be more of a market for them. So anyway,
I would think that we would want to, like we had already heard a little bit about having maybe some options, so a smaller piece could have some cottages. There's already a requirement for one parking unit per cottage, correct? So we don't have that worry where we're gonna have more cottages than parking places. And we don't have big land lots to do on this. I was in the service for several years, and this is like the model for housing on a military base. is
Yeah, but it
cottage clusters.
sucks.
Yeah, and I actually
The
grew up.
military uses it.
I lived in them. They're not great.
No, they're not. But, I mean, but that was the military's.
No, I know.
right? And there's some communities that I grew up around outside Chicago in the suburbs, post World War II construction
Yeah.
communities that were the same
Sure.
way. We're just a series of cottage clusters throughout one town and stuff. But I'm surprised to see that.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I would add is I actually talked with a gal, a friend of mine who works for, I believe she works for United Way. And they're looking at trying to do some projects for elderly housing
Right.
with that cottage cluster model. So that's the other thing. I mean, for what it's worth, I can see this as being a valuable tool for someone who maybe has a little bit larger parcel and says, oh, you know what? I'm gonna build a little cottage community for, retiree folks that want to have a smaller space to maintain and they need a smaller house and all of that. So you might see some things like that because we know based on all the stuff that we've done over the last few years, we do have an aging community. We do have a need for different housing types to serve different demographics in our community. I think really the biggest thing in my mind on this, I mean, it was my direction to Matt and Brandon at the beginning of this project, hey, on cottage clusters, let's lift the state minimums and just apply it. Like I don't think it's huge to go into it. But if Planning Commission is like, hey, you know what, let's get rid of that 8 total units per development and have no cap and just let the design standards drive, that's an easy strikeout. I mean, that's something that we can consider. But it really is up to you guys on stuff like that.
Yeah, you could remove the 8 or you could bump it to 12. Right now, we don't have in the code a cap on the number of clusters. You'd say, well, we're not sure we want like massive cottage cluster developments. You could put a cap of no more than 2 or 3 clusters within a cottage cluster development. So there are some things I think you could do that would sort of balance a certain amount of flexibility with some sideboards. So I'll just kind of put that out there.
Commissioner Burrs?
So I see when you talk about the aging community, I mean, this community has attracted some retirement living places.
Right.
And I can see instead of having the hotel type look to it, that they not only build that, but they also buy some adjoining lots and create some cottage clusters for, for folks to live in those too.
Sure.
I know like the towers over Mount Angel have those kind of places and stuff. And I see that happening here, so.
Yeah.
It may be something that is used and, I don't know what everybody else's thoughts, but I'd probably take away the maximum of 8 and just, like I say, kind of let the other things cap, like how big a lot you have, but I wouldn't have a minimum of 30,000 on that lot.
And we can't. I mean, no, we can't do that anymore. That's what our code currently was at,
It's
which
down
is
to 7.
7. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to discount base housing, just kind of, I get a little twitch.
Yeah.
There are some beautiful cottage clusters. We were in Colorado just over Thanksgiving, and there's some really, really nice ones. And I think that what might be helpful for kinesthetic learners like myself, if we could get kind of a visual, right, on some of these things, I think particularly for folks that are kind of unaware of this, it might be helpful. And maybe looking at, a 1 or 2 cluster site versus, 3 or 4 or whatever. I think just seeing it visually might help somebody like me that, because I'm playing a bunch of different scenarios in my head, and I can imagine that people have no exposure to this are probably going, I don't even know what this is.
Yeah, and we can definitely do that. I know we've got some images of some developments both in and outside of Oregon that have cottage clusters and where there's at least more than one cluster. Like there's a development in city in Newport.
Yes, I was just gonna say in Newport,
Yeah.
there's one in Newport outside the college.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's brand new.
Well, I think-
It
and they
doesn't look like base housing.
No, and Matt had that on, I think, our very first presentation.
Yeah.
Yep, and I think there's at least one area there where there's I think 2 clusters at least.
Yes,
kinda
there
next
is
to each other.
several clusters in the, yeah.
So
over
we could
there.
bring some additional images
I
from that
would
and
just
other
like to
places.
add, and I'm going to skip ahead because I read the slide just a few minutes ago, but one of the things that the survey talked about, and this is something anyone who lives in Kaiser has heard, that we would like to see more affordable housing. And so Cottage Cluster would be a way to provide some affordable housing for somebody who wants to own a home opposed to having an apartment. We talked about the other, and it's an alternative to having like a mobile home park. Essentially, that's what they end up. You're talking really small homes for a single or like empty nester group. I mean, I just wouldn't want to be restrictive on something like that because it might be, maybe it doesn't fit our community now, but who knows if our urban boundary changes or what little areas can happen now that we could do it.
Did you just say urban growth? We don't say that word.
I know, it's like, it's taboo, right? Don't mention that. It's Voldemort. We should not speak.
Okay.
All right.
That was,
Clear as mud for you?
Great. Yeah, that helps us. I think like Shane said on some of the other issues earlier, that'll help us bring something back to you.
Yeah.
What I was hearing though is that we have to put in the description that it can't look like base housing.
I definitely heard that. May
That's
not
what
look like
I
base
heard.
housing.
Well,
I don't know if
unless
that's
it's
a
Air
clear
Force
and
base
objective
housing.
standard.
Well, I was in the Air Force, yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, base housing in the Air Force comes with like, people that clean and cook for you.
Yeah, right.
I lived on a Marine Corps
All
base.
I
Marine
can say
Corps
is that there's choices in life, and maybe I need a better choice than you did. That's all I can say.
This is taking a way weird turn.
all right.
Air Force is definitely smart. I was in the Navy. We had a coffin rack. It was, it's not great.
Deadwood fire. Sticks and stone.
Okay. Let's see, where was I? So,
I think you were just
let's
above the option.
digress. Yeah. Oh, I don't think I mentioned the open space standard. So, the city can require no more than 150 square feet of open space per unit for the common courtyard specifically. So the more units you allow, the greater open space you're naturally going to be able to allow. And we recommend some amendments to other areas just to reference and to defer to other residential design and development standards in the code, mainly just to try and avoid redundancy. We recommend, or we removed several requirements that either are more restrictive than the model code or single family standards, or they're either not clear and objective. The city will also need to remove the various submittal requirements and review procedures and approval criteria and just various other procedures that don't apply to single family detached. So let's see, city could also retain most of these standards if they, or pretty much all of them really, if you guys chose to redefine cottage cluster as an entirely new housing type that would be separate from the HB 2001 requirements, such as redefining it as cluster housing. However, the city would still need to add cottage cluster as HB 2001 recognizes it. And it'd still be subject to various design and development standards as we've outlined here. Just one thing to note, if the city did choose to go that route and redefine this current cottage cluster section as something entirely different, you'd still need to keep revise some clear design standards to be clear and objective, because the state requires that all housing, regardless of whether it's subject to HB 2001, needs to be clear and objective. So any comments or questions on that option, or?
That just sounds really confusing. I mean,
It would be, I think, confusing, and I don't know how helpful it'd be, frankly. But that's just kind of.
Yeah, it would, I mean, my unasked for opinion would be I'd prefer to not do it that way, just for Dina and I's sanity, for future trying to help people through the development process. And especially just because we're shifting so much as it is. And it's not like we have people knocking down our office door to build cottage clusters or to even to inquire about it at this time. I do truly believe that with the state's model on cottage cluster development, I think it will incentivize some property owners to go, hey, I maybe would try this out. And I think we will see some get built. I mean, I do think that'll be a case. I've got two different guys that own properties that I think the one guy is very into his trees and his landscaping, and he loves the idea of building a little cottage, and he's got a big lot. And I could totally see him doing it in the next few years because he's been looking to redevelop for a while, and he's kind of waiting to see how things go. But yeah, it would not be my recommendation that we have two separate cottage cluster and cluster housing. I think it would be hard to navigate.
I think for Dina's sanity, it makes sense. For yours, yeah.
All right, well, that one's settled then.
That was easy.
Yeah. Moving on to approval procedures. We've already touched on this a bit, but middle housing will need to be subject to all the same approval and review procedures that currently apply to single family. So section 2.315 of the code establishes that standards and procedures that applies to most development in the city. So single family, along with duplexes and triplexes, are currently exempt from these requirements. So the city will also just need to exempt quadplexes and cottage clusters as well. And then not many other procedures need to change. Currently, most housing is subject to the type 1 development review action. So the city already mostly complies here. The only real change will be to add cottage clusters to that application and review type, that type 1 that is. And there are also some public facility and street improvement requirements that currently only apply to single family and duplexes. So similarly, those requirements will also need to be applied to the other middle housing types. So any questions or comments on procedures? It's fairly minimal changes there. Okay. So moving on to the open house and survey results. So this open house and survey were open for roughly a month and got pretty good traffic. The open house received about 572 total visits. And then of those, we got 125 survey responses. So the majority of those visits, as you can see in the chart there, were right around the beginning of December. I think that's when the initial launch was, or the big push on social media, I assume. So we included several questions relating to some of the policy options that we've discussed and other areas of flexibility. And as you can see here, there was slightly more support for just allowing general flexibility, and there was a little bit more support among respondents for allowing detached plexes and allowing ADUs on lots with middle housing. And then, as you can imagine, there was a lot of opposition to the ideas of allowing smaller lot sizes and less parking, and there was also less support for requiring fewer design options, or design standards, that is. And then we also had some open-ended questions, and some of the general trends that we kind of gleaned from these responses were that there's just a common desire for more affordable housing and homeownership opportunities, and that there's a decent amount of support for the city having just a variety of housing options in general. Some of the most common concerns were over the new rules in middle housing were related to overcrowding and parking availability and traffic congestion. So worth mentioning again, as we discussed at the last meeting, that the survey is technically not statistically valid, or a statistically valid representation of the entire community per se. Just based on a little demographic analysis, we found that the survey pool just had a much higher home ownership rates, higher levels of education, higher income levels, not this totally representative racial composition of the city. So we've included those detailed figures in the open house and survey summary report, which I think you all got in your packets. So that's not to say that these results aren't useful or informative in any way. It still gives some community input, but we're also not saying that the city should use these findings as the basis of, as the sole basis at least of any policy decisions. So any questions or comments regarding open house and survey?
No, I mean, I think, I'm a little disappointed in the numbers. And I think the outreach could have clearly been better, but I don't know if that's as much I think that's more of a factor of when it was out. You know, you're kind of right at the peak of the holiday season and everything else like that. You know, a pretty good survey sample is about 400 to 450, you know, that kind of hit that 1%, and we're well below that. Which I think indicates that not a lot of people are really engaged in this, which is not surprising because we're not talking about urban chickens, but yeah.
Somewhat disappointing, but not surprising,
Right.
I guess is the way I would also put it. I wouldn't call it not terrible. I've definitely seen worse or lower percentage rates, even in larger communities.
Right.
And you're right, like if you're trying to get a statistically valid survey, you are looking for 300 to 400 respondents, and but you've got to work pretty hard to get that kind of response too. It's a little tougher sometimes to get that from an online survey. So, but yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said there.
Yeah, that's a valid point, and I think as we discussed last time, you're a little bit limited in your outreach with this timeline, and we only have online virtual means to get to people. So all that said, as Matt mentioned, that it's actually not bad compared to other online efforts we've had in other communities. There's often less than like 20 people who respond, so relatively speaking, it's not terrible. Hopefully it's still useful nonetheless. So let's move on to the policy options. So two of the big policy options we discussed last time were detached plexes and ADUs. So we'll revisit that here. So if the city chooses to allow detached plexes, we'd recommend simply defining them separately from attached plexes. That can get a little confusing, but they'd essentially be a distinct housing type that would have separate requirements, but the city could apply any of the required middle housing rules to these housing types if they wanted to. So this has generally been DLCD's recommendation for detached plexes, mainly because using separate definition will help cities avoid just the legal ambiguity around it, and also because detached plexes aren't a required middle housing type. Again, there's just that legal kind of gray area, so just the simplest way to avoid that would just be to call them something else. So it's also important to note that the city probably wouldn't be required to allow middle housing land divisions for detached plexes. So regardless of how they're defined, however, the city could likely choose to allow middle housing land divisions for detached plexes if they chose to. So it's still not very certain at this point, but I believe that's DLCD's current interpretation. And we're still kind of waiting on a definitive answer in that regard.
So does that make, is everybody tracking with that? Is that making sense? I think it's kind of confusing. So I want to like maybe just stop and does it make sense? Do you have questions about it? No, it does not make sense. Or yes, it makes sense, and no, you don't have questions.
Yeah, I mean, I
So
think
here's your options. One option is don't allow detached plexus. Because you don't have to. You need to allow plexus, but you don't have to allow detached plexus. So that's one option. Second option is to allow detached plexus and call them detached plexus. If you do that, then those detached plexes will be subject to all of the HB 2001 requirements, all the things we've been talking about related to parking, related to certain, only being able to apply certain types of design standards, et cetera. They will also be subject to the SB 458 requirements that would then allow for middle housing land divisions for those detached plexes, and that they would go through that expedited process if somebody wanted to do that. Option 3 is allow something that is essentially a detached plex, but don't call it that. Call it something else in your code. And if you do that, then you can apply some different standards to it, and you don't have to, it's not necessarily subject, unless you want it to be, to the SB 458 requirements. Did I get that right? Yeah. So those are kind of your 3 options. And what we're saying is that in our discussions with DLCD, they have said, if the city wants more flexibility and they don't want sort of ambiguity about what you do or don't have to apply to detached plexes, then that third option is potentially better because it gives you more flexibility in terms of the types of standards you can apply, and it gives you the option of applying the SB 458 middle housing land divisions to those detached plex lots or not. So I think our question for you is, do you have any thoughts or comments or preferences around those 3 options associated with detached plexes? And partly given, we heard in the survey, even though again, not statistically representative, but we did hear a certain amount of support, more than 50%, I think, for allowing for detached plexes. So I'll stop there, but that's.
So I'm going to ask if there's an option 4, and I'm throwing this back to our numbers game from years ago, and Shane's just going, no, please don't. Is there an option to not allow the detached, but then have a separate definition that would allow the 4, but not do the land division?
Yeah, you could allow for the 4, but not say somebody has to be able to do the middle housing land division, but you'd still have to define it differently. You'd have to call it something else.
That wasn't very clear of an answer. Okay.
Maybe rephrase the question, and I'll see if I can do.
So for the quadplexes for the middle housing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we say we don't want to do detached plexes for the middle housing definition, but we create a separate sort of housing type that could allow, is that more clear?
Yes. And then what's your sort of follow-up question is?
And that's kind of a combination of like 1 and 3, I think is what I'm.
You could do that.
Okay.
Yes.
So we're combining 1 and 3.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
still
The
would
option
just,
you gave
again,
us is
yes,
one
you
and
can
three.
allow them but you just need to call them something else.
Something different. The
essentially.
third option has to be something different.
Well,
It's just describing them in your code as this different kind of housing. I'm trying to remember,
Shane's
we
going,
proposed this in, or Wilsonville adopted an updated set of standards to comply with HB 2001, and they essentially went with that option. So they called them something else. They allowed them, but they called them something else, and they didn't apply all of the HB 2001 or SB 458 requirements.
So I have a question for you. So could we, I know in our last discussion, and this was a point that I was thinking about, is the land that we have in Kaiser, there's a lot of larger lots, 0.4, 0.5 acre lots with a single family home on them. Could we have like, say, option 1, no detached quads, but then have an option for single family homeowners in those that meet the lot size to be able to have a detached duplex or triplex on that, detached from the main house, but it would be attached
to each other.
to each other, right? Right, to allow the infill, because that, I mean,
So
before
you
you
got an
guys
8,000
came,
square foot lot, single family.
And behind it, there's 3 or 2 units that are attached together, because that's where I see.
Actually, lot size,
where our infill, like, we were told that our buildable land survey, that's what we gotta do. Like, we gotta find ways to utilize this land that we have, because we don't have 5-acre lots with nothing on them.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the short answer is yes.
Okay,
I guess the question I'd have is, Shane, is this blowing your mind up?
right.
Because I mean, ultimately, you guys
A
have
little
to
bit.
apply this
I
code.
purposely didn't look at Shane.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, 'cause
So let me just say this. I think that concept, like, you know, when I said, hey, cottage clusters or cluster housing, and what's the difference? This like takes it to a whole nother level in my mind of confusion. But truthfully, I think that what I'm looking for what I'm asking for from Planning Commission with this kind of a conversation here is not so much the details. Let us kind of work through some of those details. It really is more that high level look of, first and foremost, we did get some survey results back, and there was some interest in being flexible in that. I frankly was sort of surprised, based on the phone calls that I take when a partition comes in that's a standard partition. But that being said, I think that from a policy level, what would be helpful for me to hear is, one, is Planning Commission interested in allowing for detached plexes to be that form of infill development versus being standardized land division that have public notices to neighbors and all of that kind of stuff? Or do we want to say, does Planning Commission feel like, if somebody wants to redevelop their lot and convert a house to a duplex or convert a house to a fourplex, that's one thing, because the house is already there, it's been there, and yeah, it's gonna get bigger and it's gonna change, but they could do that with any addition, right? I mean, yes, it's adding people, but it's not changing impact or expected impact to adjacent neighbors necessarily. Whereas you build a second home in a backyard, or a second and a third home, or a duplex in a backyard, or a triplex in a backyard, and a single family out front, that's kind of the policy piece that I want to hear from y'all on what is it that you think we should allow. And then I know the last time we had the meeting, I think it was Commissioner Grenz that brought up some concerns of, and if we allow that, and then somebody can come back in and divide it through SB 458, and they don't actually have access, and they don't have these other things, and they've built it one way and there's no services, and now they have to put in services. I guess that's kind of what I want to hear from Planning Commission, is kind of what is your reaction to the concept at this stage? Because I think it gets pretty confusing, especially if we were to say, okay, in the single family zone, in the RM zone, in the RL zone, we allow single family dwellings, we allow duplexes, we allow quadplexes, we allow triplexes, and those are all going to be considered middle housing. And then we have this new category that says we allow a mix of dwelling units on lots of certain sizes. Then from an applicability perspective, that's part of my concern, just from my end, is, okay, how do we differentiate between the two? But if that's the route that Planning Commission wants to go, say, yeah, let's add some flexibility and add multiple units, but because the only concern I see, and Matt jump in, or Brandon jump in if I'm wrong, the only real difference between allowing a detached plex under the HB 2001 provision is that it would automatically be subjected to the SB 458 expedited land division. And so if that's a big concern to do that, one, I'm not sure why. It doesn't change the built environment. It's literally somebody condominiumizing development. And yes, it could skirt development, but I think that's I guess what I'm looking at from my perspective. I think the bigger question is, do we want to allow detached plexes, or do we want them to be more the standardized version of what a duplex, what a quadplex, what a triplex is from that policy level? And then I think these guys are smarter than me, and they can help me figure out some options.
Well, so Commissioner Grant said something, and it kind of rung true with it. I think if we can focus in on kind of cottage cluster descriptions and how that's all going to play out. I think that accomplishes sort of that detached quad or tri or whatever else, or however it's going to be. And I think that there's some logic to letting that be what it's going to be. And I think it's more conducive to that kind of environment. This is just me saying, and I think in a traditional setting, not allowing detached plexes on is more my personal preference. I think the cottage clusters accomplishes that sort of higher density on a smaller lot concept, but in your more sort of, triplex quad, keeping it contiguous, I think for me personally has more logic to it.
Okay, I agree with much of what Chair Lauer just said. I would like to see, for new construction, I can completely see us just say no detached quads or tris, because that's basically a cottage. They could do a cottage cluster is what they're doing. I'm just looking at all that land that we have in Kaiser that was on that map several months ago that said this land has to be developed, and we still don't have enough land to meet the growth needs. How do we help those individuals be able to develop their land? Or how do we help Kaiser build more housing to help reduce the cost of housing and provide more affordable housing? How do we do that? And I see an option in that if we allow detached, that would give more flexibility. Not to say that people, and for I guess the other thing for policy, it'd be no different if someone just tore a house down, they could build a quadplex without any kind of change. I mean, they just go in and say, I'm doing this. So the community doesn't get notified. They don't get told that there's going to be 4 units on this piece that had 1 unit. They just get to do it. So allowing them to do it and keeping the 1 house and adding 3 isn't changing policy at all, because someone could just say, I'm just going to tear the house down and build 4. And they could do it without any kind of change. So I don't know if that argument would be, I don't know if there's a policy change that needs to be done with that if we have detached or attached, because they could do either one with that. The only thing is we have to decide is if we want to use that land that some people may want to do with it, or are we not going, if we're going to make it more restrictive and make them tear the house down opposed to keeping the 1 house and adding 2 or 3 behind their house. That's really the question that we have to decide. Because we have an option 3, which means that we don't have to make that land subject to be divided by the Senate bill. So that would, I want to hear your guys' opinion on this, like what my colleagues here feel about that.
Yeah,
Okay, this is probably a dumb question, but so they've got this 7,000 square foot lot and they can put a triplex on it or whatever, and there's a house there already. So if they were to build 2 more detached, I used to make it all detached triplexes on a 7,000 square foot lot, what makes that different than building 3 single family homes there? Only we wouldn't allow them to build 3 single family homes there. Does that make any sense?
No, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. And that is kind of the crux of the discussion of a detached plex discussion. And I mean, Matt might be able to speak to this better than I can. What I would say is that, this bill was kind of listed as a housing choice kind of bill. It wasn't like an affordable housing bill, although affordability was an element of it. And so I do think there is some validity to, absolutely, Commissioner Saldivar, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I don't know that there's a right or a wrong answer in this case. It really is, you guys are the Planning Commission. So, it really is, this is kind of one of those things that depending on the direction you go, it may have different implications for neighborhood livability. And I have the same questions on housing affordability, I think, that you do, because I look at it from a couple perspectives. One of the kind of strategies for providing things like townhouses. Townhouses historically represent a lower entry point for home ownership because there's less land associated with it, there's less square footage associated with it, and it's a different housing type in kind of a different area. So if you're wanting to allow the detached plexes but not allow them to be divided, or you're wanting to allow, let's go with the cottage clusters, because those are limited to how many square feet cottage clusters for ground floor?
900 square foot.
So you've got automatically a smaller footprint that somebody would be buying. So if those get divided up into separated ownership through SB 458, that could theoretically represent a lower market entry point because you're buying less square footage. And we know that, price per square foot is what drives real estate, although it's kind of this sliding scale because the larger you get, generally the price per square foot goes down a little bit, but, whatever. So, I really do think it's a matter of, and maybe we could provide some examples of how the difference of what would look like of a detached plex versus a cottage cluster or something. I don't know if you guys have anything like that.
Some of the, I think we sent out some of those test fit diagrams, and
Yeah.
some of those do show essentially detached plexes, and they do, and they don't have all the features of a cottage cluster because they're not necessarily oriented around a common courtyard, which again is kind of one of the defining features of a cottage cluster. So those test fits we sent out are sort of like, they look a little bit like that graphic up in the top. But, we sort of showed them more on, here's what it could look like on this size lot, or this size lot, or this size lot, in different configurations. So that gives you some sense of it. I think I'd agree with everything Shane said a moment ago. I'll also just note sort of what some of the policy discussion was during the development of the Middle Housing Model Code and the administrative rules. So there was a lot of discussion on this, and we've had a fair bit of discussion in like every community we've worked in on this particular issue, because it does represent, most people think of plexes as attached. So part of the discussion was, look, sort of the traditional definition of a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex is an attached form of housing, and it's confusing to say it can be detached. So that was one. Two was, but if they're detached and if you can divide it, which is partly why SB 458 came in, it increases the chance those might be ownership units. So it sort of increases opportunities for home ownership. There's definitely there wasn't a lot of discussion about this during that period, but sort of within our firm, there's sort of the issue of, well, isn't that just for single family houses on a single lot, and our developer's going to kind of do that instead of that? I think, that's a potential concern, how often that's going to happen. It really is a different market because you're doing it on a smaller lot. The access is different. So I think it's going to be sort of more of a niche thing, again, than like, you're going to see this everywhere if you allow for detached units. The last thing that people talked about was simply, it provides more flexibility for both a homeowner and a developer, particularly where you get a weird shaped lot, whether it's like a deep lot or an L-shaped lot or whatever. It can be hard to build an attached triplex or quadplex on a lot like that. Easier to potentially fit something like this in. And then the last thing I'll note is just like, the cost to do them can be a little more if they're detached units because you don't have common walls. I've heard actually both. I've heard people say both things. Somebody else say, well, actually the cost to develop something from a building and fire code perspective is not that much cheaper to build the attached unit. So who knows? I think it's sort of more choice and flexibility, less certainty, or more impacts you don't know about. I would also agree with Commissioner Saldivar that like from the impact of like the number of units, parking, et cetera, there's not a lot of difference. It's just really the form of the housing and the sort of physical access to it.
Yeah.
That's the main thing from my perspective that you're sort of thinking about or trading or deciding to
and I would
pattern.
echo that. I think the form of the housing is really what you're talking about, and I think there's trade-offs both ways. If somebody builds a detached plex, so you take West Kaiser, and you take all the lots along West Kaiser on like Dennis or Sunset, where you've got lots that are a third to a half acre size, but maybe they're narrow. Or maybe they got a big ranch that doesn't have any access to the backyard, so people can't get a legal means of access to them for firefighting. So they can't really divide it unless a neighbor wants to come in. With a detached plex option, somebody can plop down a second house in the backyard and have a footpath to it, and that would be absolutely allowable. So it does give some flexibility, but it also adds another house in the backyard. And it may be where you've got 412 pitched ranches that are 16 feet tall. And now in the residential zone, you have a 35-foot height. So if somebody builds a very large 2-story house that's looming over the neighbor's properties, that's the kind of impacts that you might see. And it's not that there's nothing wrong with it, it's just the reality of it. So that really is kind of the question, whereas if you take that same lot and you have an existing home and you're converting it or you're tearing it down and building new, it's one building massing located on a property versus 2 building massings or 3 building massings or 4 building massings. So, I mean, I think it is kind of a 6 of one, half dozen of another in some regards. So, I mean, it really is up to you guys on that. Initially when the bill came out, I was very much of the opinion that I think you just leave it simple and duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, everybody knows what those are. That's what you allow people to do. But, some of y'all have raised some good points. So I think there's validity to both approaches. So.
Commissioner Sullivan.
I just wanted to answer, and I'm sorry, I can't see your name, and what would you,
Sarah.
your name?
Sarah.
Sarah, I thought it was Sarah, I got terrible
Sorry.
eyesight and hearing. Sarah, you made a comment about the single-family home on a 7,000 square foot lot and adding to that. Most likely, that would be very difficult to do because that ranch is gonna encompass a large portion. So you're not, we still have to meet setbacks, right? That doesn't change. So the idea that you could build, on a 7,000 square foot lot that has a ranch on it, and you're gonna build 3 units on there without tearing the ranch down, detached, I don't know if that you could do that unless the house is like a 15 by 15, house or something, because you had the setback still. So you're not gonna see a quadplex put behind a ranch or a triplex put behind a ranch on a 7,000 square foot home.
It was just an example more of how people could skirt our 5,000 square foot rule for a single family. That was more what I was getting at.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Is there anything else on detached?
And we don't have to make a decision here.
this is a super tough one, right?
But it
Because
is
I
tough.
think
It
that
is hard, yeah.
I think we're doing really good things in so many other areas in terms of like the apartments and the mixed use and so many other things. So I think but I have some concerns on the mixed use because it was sold as you can work downstairs and live upstairs. Well, that's factually inaccurate. I mean, I talked to a friend of mine has a shop over at the one in Sonic. She said, there's no way I could afford to live in the apartments above it because it's $500 more a month than my mortgage. But we're providing a lot more opportunity with, apartments and some of these other things. I just feel like, as a personal issue, I feel like detached is just, I think it's an opportunity to, as Commissioner Hodges said, kind of skirt the issue. For me, I'm solid in the attached ADUs, but that's my own personal thing. Shane.
I was going to say that, and that's the one other thing to remember. This project, we had to come into this project with a really tight timeline for when everything got adopted versus implementation versus us getting some funding and some help so could get this project done. We are in this compressed timeline. So the one thing to remember is even when we get through the adoption process, we know we have to adopt at a bare minimum, the state minimum.
Right.
There is nothing that would prevent us from revisiting some of these issues if Planning Commission doesn't feel that they've got the consensus or, you're not sure. I mean, there would be nothing to prevent us from saying, okay, if we move forward and go with just the standard version of plexes, and then we revisit it down the road if we start to see a lot of development coming in that is, we wish we could do plexes, because it would open something out. Remember, we can always revisit that part because we can always lessen the standard of our code down the road as well. So I don't know if that helps you, but I don't feel like we're getting super far along the way on this discussion quite yet tonight. So if it helps, we can continue to talk about this as we move down the road. And even if we adopted one way, we could swing back and allow the detached later on too.
Commissioner Grants and then Commissioner Burson.
Councilor Duran, does council, have they discussed this at all? Do we have any feeling for what kind of policy direction they would like to take?
It hasn't been discussed yet. It's just roughly been, given the examples of what could happen. So I have my own, thoughts on things because this is my industry. So I've already seen some stuff. People are already on their, thinking of what they can do. I haven't here in Kaiser yet, but in the city of Salem, I've already got customers planning what they're going to do even before the rules are defined. So people are going to take advantage of this, especially people that own rental properties. So.
Can you tell us more where you would be leaning, or what are you seeing people doing, wanting detached or no?
It's difficult because you guys don't see the emails that come through with people frantic about building in their backyard that we've had recently, and I can just see more. As people start building and condensing more, there's going to be a lot of people upset that feel that their rights are being taken away because there's a house right up, or a ADU right up next to their property line. But that's, these are the rules, and this is what people, have to live by. If they don't like it, then they're gonna have to move out of town. But that's, that's kind of unfortunate.
Do you think attached units prevent that more, or it's,
I think attached units would probably make people a little more comfortable in their, in their neighborhood than having little detached cottages, in the backyard. That's just my thoughts. I don't know if that's realistic.
Commissioner Person.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to say, the option 3, I'm just not really in favor of it because just renaming it to try to get around Senate Bill 458 seems like that's going to be a legal challenge at some time that would be fought. Because, just renaming it, all of a sudden we can not subdivide the lots. So, I think there was a reason for that. And like I say, I think part of that is to have some ownership. And I think you take that option away from folks to be able to, whatever they build in that backyard or on that lot, not being able to own it. So that's just kind of where I'm at. But I'm not ready to make a decision on this tonight.
I just was gonna say, to clarify, I think, I only would look, asking about an exception for lots that already have a house on it. Like, I think new construction, we can say no detached and just leave it at traditional triplexes and quadplexes. I was only thinking about the pieces of land in like West Kaiser that are half acre and they can't get to 23 feet. What is it, 24 feet?
It's generally 20.
Feet to get the access for the fire lane, and that would give them an option to have a detached. But those individuals are, if they're serious, they'll just have the behemoth structure is still going to get built, right? So what they can do is just attach it to, so you'll have a ranch with 3-unit, 2-story behind it attached. So it's still going to get built that way. It's just there's going to have that. No, I'm serious. It's still, if there's a need and there's money to be made, then that's what's going to happen. It just would be more flexible if it was. I think it actually would look nicer if the building was separate from the ranch aesthetically, if it was in my neighborhood. But if someone wants to do it, they can do it right now. Once this passes, they'll be able to put 3 units back there attached to their home, and they'll have a 2-story unit, just like a room addition, but it would be longer, and they'll have their quad or triplex on there. So that's going to happen one way or another with this code change. And I'll go either way, whatever the group goes. I'm speaking in that exception piece. That's it. So that's just to clarify.
So not a lot of direction.
Right.
I think that's okay for now. I think the good news is we have a lot of other direction, so we can keep refining that. I think the plan at the next month's meeting, we are going to be bringing back kind of the version or the second set of drafts. And it also can give you guys some time to kind of think about things. And, you know, over the next few weeks, if you have questions, reach out to me. If you have thoughts, jot them down and we can talk about them some more. We really just have to get to a point of knowing kind of what direction. I mean, if we don't know what direction we're going, ultimately you'll end up with a recommendation when we get to the adoption phase that comes from me working and Dina working with the consultant and us kind of putting our heads together going, okay, like, I mean, this is my community. I've lived here my whole life. Like, I know what kind of calls I take. I know what the market kind of is doing. And so I will make Shane's truly, this is my recommendation if that's what I have to do.
Right.
And then my feelings will not be hurt if you say, Shane, you're dumb. Like, we should go this other route. Like, that's the way it is. You guys are the governing body. So it's not imperative that we have super clear direction on this. But I will say I'm hearing enough concerns and enough support that it definitely feels like a mixed bag. And honestly, from day one, this concept has been the hardest thing for me personally to wrangle with in my head and to think through the different partitions I have approved over the years and the challenges with small subdivisions and infill development and trying to balance neighborhood concerns of infill development and the impacts and, oh, this is going to devalue my property. And sometimes I say, well, actually, you're probably going to get a new comp, so it might actually help your property value from a real estate market perspective. But it also changes what somebody bought into with a neighborhood with a certain fabric and how houses were massed and structures were oriented. So, I mean, there's validity on both sides of things. So, you know, I mean, I think we're okay. We'll move forward with it. And then just think about it some more. And hopefully we'll get a little more clarity before we have to come to public hearing with it.
Yeah, and the one other thing I would just add, I agree with all that, and just say too that the next batch of stuff we bring you will also include the code provisions related to SB 458, and that'll give you a little more information about, okay, what's it mean to go through that middle housing land division, and if that's applied to properties that are either attached or detached plexes, you know, that might help you think about it a little bit more too. So I'd agree. It's okay to have just had a good discussion about it and not necessarily have consensus direction tonight. And that might help us get there at the next one. And at some point, as Shane said, we'll get there, you know. So I think this is all fine.
And I think and Shane, I apologize for the potential work that might come from this. I think that as we're going to the next meeting, if there's, for example, type scenarios, I would say reach out to Shane and Dina and just say,
Yep.
you know, what does this look like? And I think if we play out some of those what ifs, because I can think of a half a dozen right now that I'm like, it could really sort of influence my personal feelings on this one way or another. So I think if there's those scenarios, get them to them as soon as possible. So you can play those scenarios out a little bit and then provide some hypotheticals. Because I think it'll help us be more prepared for our next meeting and kind of having to understand. But I certainly think that having that Senate Bill 458 language is going to be helpful as well. Just because I think I agree with Commissioner Hutchins on that 100%, where it's like, yeah, okay, great. Now I got, 4 single-family residentials on these itty-bitty tiny lots that directly go against the minimum lot size concept. But
Yeah, and I would just reiterate that, Chair Lawyer, for sure, if you all have questions or thoughts about specific properties in your neighborhood, like, give me a call, shoot me an email. I will do my best to be as available as I can over the next few weeks. But honestly, it's very helpful to have, because I will say this, I've been doing this job for a while now. I've been at the city for a very long time and doing land use for a very long time. And pretty much whenever we change code provisions, there is unforeseen consequences that end up coming up with projects, which is why we constantly bring back changes. Like, I don't know, we had to amend the ADU section 14 times.
Twice in the last 2 years.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the other reality, is that for me, I do get a little bit gun shy about how far we go and how deep we dive right off the bat. not knowing, okay, how is this going to play out? And, you know, kind of, you can't unring the bell sort of thing too. So, you know, I kind of tend to lean towards a little bit of a more cautious provision. I mean, especially because I felt like we did immense work creating the River Cherry Overlay District, getting very progressive with some of the provisions we placed in that area. And from an analysis perspective, we said, hey, this area makes absolute sense to take some sideboards off because it's closer to transit, it's closer to services, it makes more sense for that really increased density. It's going to still be uncomfortable for those neighborhoods, but we felt like it made sense. And so it's hard. We got that project done and like, boom, right after when we start seeing some things start to take advantage of that, now we've got this new thing that's like, hey, here's a really, really big change to existing neighborhoods. And so I think there is that feeling of, okay, how much is enough versus how much more does the city need to do versus, okay, this is as much as we can do. And so now then there's other bigger UGB type discussions that have to happen and things. So anyway, yeah, for what it's worth.
Yeah, and
We'll figure it
I
out.
think there's another thing that exists in the universe right now with DLCD is in that they're kind of taking a look at some urban growth boundary allowances and some other things. Am I accurate in saying that?
I don't know how to respond to that, to be honest.
Well, I mean, yeah,
I don't know. I haven't been paying attention to that aspect of what they're looking at.
okay. Well, it'll just be interesting. I think there's a national conversation, particularly around true affordable housing, and I think the state is taking a very hard look at what that looks like. And I think that what may come of that is hopefully what could come of that is some flexibility in terms of jurisdictions' ability to maybe look at some UGB expansions and stuff like that. So, I mean, I think that will solve a tremendous amount of issues that we have where we can really be very specific in sort of how that is looked at. I mean, if it ever comes, I think Shane will be retired by then. I'll probably be retired by then. But yeah, one can always hope, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, Commissioner.
well, I found it a big relief when the projections for the 20-year growth were revised very far down. You know, we were looking at 20,000 new people coming in the next 20 years, and now it's down to 5. So I don't think we have to be as worried about making things super dense and getting enough housing because we have far fewer people that we have to accommodate now with those revised estimates.
Yeah, I had the exact opposite reaction with that. It scared me
Oh.
because I think it's grossly underprojected.
Oh,
And I
really?
think that it's going to put us in a position where we're going to underplan.
I don't know. I mean, where are these people coming from?
Yeah, well,
They're moving out.
yeah, that's, yeah.
Oh, well, it needs to be seen, but I just
Yeah,
felt
no,
like it
because
didn't have to be as nervous
it went
about-
down and then it came back up a little bit, but I still think it's quite a bit lower than what reality is.
Yeah, I think that it is a very difficult dynamic, and I think there's essentially a couple different ways that people tend to look at it. You know, sometimes it's just looked at as for kind of a simplistic supply and demand type of model. So you have a bigger supply, then the prices come down. But with the housing market, and I think that the world is a very rapidly changing place, and I think the last couple years have really demonstrated that in the sense of how the workforce has shifted. And so many folks went away from traditional workplace.
Yeah.
You got to live where you're working to where now you can live wherever you want to live and you work from wherever you want to work from. And so I you know, at the national level, and planners around the country are talking about this, like, what is this going to result in?
Right.
And, you know, you see in the world of long range planning, you see different trends and different things that happen a little bit like a roller coaster. I mean, shoot, freeway developments and shopping malls were all the rage for a really long time. Not so much anymore.
Yeah.
You know, there's been a shift in that. And so, you know, I think what we're seeing right now is we're living in the midst of this shift and extreme increases in affordability in housing nationwide, and extreme lack of available housing at least statewide, there's a big statewide regional housing needs analysis, and the fact that the projections are like, we are grossly underserved for true affordable housing. So I think there's a lot of unknowns, and, really the reality is that Kaiser is somewhat of a known commodity as what our community is. And so as we make changes, we're going to make changes that are going to shift some of that reality, and depending on how far we push, it can shift that reality further one way or stay a little bit more the same the other way. So that's really what's, as planning commissioners, that's kind of really what with that really big picture look, that's kind of what you're faced with is, okay, what kind of policy do we want to move forward, and what kind of Kaiser do we want to kind of shape or allow for? So, no big deal. No pressure. No pressure, guys. Gals, no pressure.
I think other than the city council, we're the only ones that have to sign an oath, right? All right, yes, sir.
If I can take a few minutes here of my commission's time. We're changing a lot of different sections of code here, so I'm going to hijack this and see if I can push something that's been on my mind for a little while in the limited residential zone and the medium density residential zone. I would like y'all to consider increasing the building height limit for multifamily housing.
To 4 stories?
No, it's currently at 35 feet to the peak. That's hard. That's really hard.
Roof pitch to 412, or if you want to do if you want to do like a 612, you're not going to be able to do it.
Where's this at?
It's one of the sections that we're looking at.
No, I understand,
Provisions.
but what, you named it off.
The limited density residential and medium density residential.
So what's an example of that?
So our RM zone property is generally where apartments live currently.
So many apartments are higher than 35 feet in Kaiser.
Not in the RM zone. So
Okay,
there's.
that's what I'm asking, like, where's that at?
I mean, I'd have
apartments I see on River Road
to,
are
honestly,
taller.
Ron, I'd have to give you a map and say
Yeah.
parcel by parcel. But so most of the apartments along River Road are on commercial properties, which are going to have a max height of 50 feet. So the new Sonic apartments that are on River Road, those had a maximum height of 50 feet because it was a mixed-use zone property and multifamily. The RM zone properties are going to be, a lot of those are in our RCOD. We've had a few projects. They're going to be, like the first property that abuts the storefront commercial that has the smaller apartment complex on it. And actually that's something that's been on my radar as well going through this process. Building heights is something that we talked about through the RCOD and ultimately kept a 50-foot building height on our River Cherry corridor kind of overlay, thinking that's about the right massing. What Commissioner Grenz is talking about is that in the residential single-family zone, our lowest density zone, we allow a 35-foot high building to be built. So 2-story homes with a pretty steep pitched roof. I've had one in all the years I've reviewed that have exceeded that 35-foot height. I've had a lot that have gotten very close. The home I currently live in is a tall 2-story house with a steep pitch, and it's like 33 feet tall or something. So that's just like that's a single family low residential zone. So I actually would kind of agree with Commissioner Grenz that when we're talking about the medium density zone, which is intended for higher density, multifamily, larger massed buildings, increasing that height would probably make some sense. So.
What other buildings in the area that are over 35 feet? None of the storefronts are.
No, most of the storefronts on River Road are 1-story structures. Most of the new apartments that are newer and have steeper pitched roofs are going to be exceeding that 35 feet.
So what about like where the Bonaventure's at?
That's mixed use zones, so those could be up to 50 feet tall. I don't remember how tall they are, but they are taller than 35 feet because they're 3-story and I think they have a 612 on them.
I'm just asking to consider it. We don't have to talk about it right
How
now.
many times do you have people come in asking to build apartments in those areas?
I've had 3 in the last year that have had issues and have had to make modifications to their structural plans to lower their heights. So it is, I mean, it is truly something that's on my radar that I'm glad that Commissioner Grenz brought it up, but that is something that when we bring back drafts, it's in my notes to chat with these guys about, to consider looking at, what is an appropriate height for a 3-story apartment complex, because that's what we end up seeing a lot. What's the difference between a 2 and a 3-story, and what can be built with kind of standardized architecture and construction practices, that things that look nice in our minds. So
I think we can come back and talk about that some more. And
Yeah.
I think it's, while we're making these changes to the code, probably makes sense to think about it.
Yep.
Yeah. We still have half a slide here to get.
Okay.
And then a next step slide, and then we're done with you.
It's normally my job to say hurry up. I apologize.
I didn't say that.
Okay, so we are on the home stretch, and at the risk of opening up another can of worms, we'll talk about ADUs here. So there were questions last time we met as to whether a single-family lot with an ADU could convert to a plex. So we've been told by DLCD that in fact conversions with ADUs could be considered part of a middle housing unit. So that is an option, and that is a route that some other cities have taken. And that could also be an advantage to allowing detached plexes, as that could help facilitate conversions where people already have a detached ADU and they might want to just add another unit. So there's just extra flexibility there. So it's just something to consider. And in cases where there are attached or internal ADUs, the building could also be converted to a quadplex or triplex by just adding another attached unit, for instance. So that could be another advantage of allowing ADUs with middle housing. And we've also determined that an ADU that is added to a middle housing lot would not necessarily have to meet the state's specific ADU requirements, because those ADU requirements are specific to ADUs on single-family lots. So theoretically, a city could, for instance, require additional design standards that the state otherwise wouldn't require.
Or you could require a parking space for that additional ADU.
Right.
Which right now you can't do if it's being added to a single-family detached home. And we're talking about this because you guys asked us the last time, well, hey, should we allow an ADU with a duplex or with a triplex or with a quadplex? So, and if we did, would it have to meet all the state standards associated with ADUs that are added to a single-family detached home? So we went and talked to DLCD and asked them some of those questions, and we're kind of coming back with, here's the answers, so that at some point you can tell us, oh, yeah, we like the idea of allowing for an ADU with a duplex or with a triplex, if you want to go that route. Because yes, you can do it, A, and B, if you do that, you can apply some additional standards that go beyond what the state currently allows you to apply for ADUs. So.
Yeah, and the only area that the state still won't budge on for ADUs or really any housing, again, is just clear and objective standards. That just applies to all housing. So that would still need to apply to an ADU that's added to a middle housing lot. So we could, if there's interest in that, we could draft or experiment with amendments that include clear and objective standards that address some concerns around ADUs with middle housing. For instance, the last time we met, there were concerns about emergency access or fire access, and could, tinker with some standards that, could maybe address some of those concerns, like emergency access conditions for ADUs with middle housing. So just things to consider. Don't need any answers right now, but is there any initial thoughts or comments there?
I think for me personally, the emergency access is a big deal, right? And maybe if there's some language in there that can address that, that might be worth looking at. But that's just me. I think ADUs typically are you know, in my experience, have been family members that need to be closer to other family. And if you have that lack of access, that creates some concern for me, I think, generally. But it's kind of one of those, I don't know. Nobody?
Well, I would think we would need to say they'd have to have another parking space as well. Because we were talking about just too many units, too dense, not enough parking, and then you just get cars everywhere on the streets, and that would be my concern.
If ADUs are included in the mix for.
Make sure you're talking to the mic. Otherwise, people can't hear you on
Sorry,
TV.
if ADUs are included in the mix for triplex, duplex, then they would fall under the requirement for having a parking spot based on lot size, right?
I mean, generally, yes. Although if they are defined as an ADU and not necessarily defined as a unit of a duplex or a unit of a triplex, then sort of under your
Then not.
current
Right.
standards, you wouldn't require one, but what we're saying is you could do that in that case. And if they were just more like you converted an ADU to become just a unit of a duplex, I'm not sure exactly why you would do that. but
Yeah,
you could,
right,
Then
right.
yes, they would be required to have a space.
And we
For that unit.
have a half a dozen ADUs, a dozen ADUs in
Yeah.
Kaiser right now?
I'd say there's probably at least a dozen. I
Dozen?
feel like we approved like 6 or 7 last year, if I remember right. And we approved a few more before that, and we'd had a few. So, yeah, there's not been a ton of ADUs built, but there's been, I would say, a dozen or more in the last few years.
Doesn't this go back to the original question we just spent a bunch of time on, if we're gonna allow detached plexus?
A little bit. I mean, it's kind of a wrinkle on that. It's a little different just because ADUs do have a certain definition in terms of they're an accessory unit. They're accessory to the primary unit. You define them differently in your code. So there are some differences, but it's a kind of related topic in a way.
Yeah, and I
It's a
would,
related concept. let's say.
I would agree with you, Commissioner. Like, if, it would be my opinion that it seems as if the Planning Commission's direction was, yes, let's go and allow detached plexes, then to me, there's a lot less necessity to allow an ADU on a middle housing lot because you're allowing multiple units. Whereas the ADU, we have to allow by state law on single family lots, and we have those standards that we revised multiple times that I don't want to change again in some regards, right? So I think I think you're hitting the nail on the head. If you were allowing detached plexes anyway, you could easily just say, hey, the ADU is going to be one of those plex units.
Right.
And that means if you want to add on to the ADU, because from a practical, ADUs are limited to 750 square feet. They're, if it's inside a building, it's a 60-40 split. So that might be where you want to convert to a duplex if it was an internal, because then that goes away and you can build the units however big you want. So there are some advantages to folks, and it would give people and homeowners options. But I think that it's a bigger question if Planning Commission says, no, we don't want to allow detached plexes, then that's probably the bigger question of, okay, if we're not going to allow detached plexes, do we want to allow an ADU on any of these lots in addition to whatever else gets built? So.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. I saw one.
I guess we have to resolve the first question before we can answer this one, right? Because that would make a determination.
Potentially.
For us, I would
Yeah,
think,
they
right?
would-
I mean,
they
if we
would make it
say
helpful.
attached only, then maybe this is an option that because it's only limited to 750. We already have the rules set up size-wise, so they're super small.
Yeah, I don't know.
Would you limit one ADU per plex site? What if they went through a middle housing division? Would each plex get an ADU?
I don't think so, Commissioner Grenz, because I think that Senate Bill 458 kind of speaks to that even if they go through a division, it's still considered a middle housing development. So you can't skirt the code that way and basically do serial middle housing and build something and then divide it expedited and then build some more things and divide it expedited. They have provisions in there to not allow that.
That is correct.
Just a series of pods lined up in the grass.
Right,
Star Trek stuff.
Yeah.
Keep track of it all.
yeah,
Which
which will be
super
awesome for me.
complicated, Right?
So I think that's probably, unless you have more comments on that one, good enough for tonight. I also sense it is getting kind of late. Probably getting a little worn out. So no worries,
Yeah.
I think some of this, it will be helpful to come back and revisit one more time after we've looked at some of the middle housing land division stuff.
Okay.
And we can come back with some additional ideas, just that reflects what we've heard so far.
Okay.
I have a lot of faith in Shane and Dina and what they've seen, and I think that their recommendations are going to be largely very helpful. I mean, that's just me personally. They're seeing what's happening on a regular basis, so, I mean, they're the experts in the field. Well, Dina at least.
All right, so on to the last one. So next steps, we've already kind of talked about this a little bit. We will be making some changes to what we had before us to reflect what we heard tonight. And then we'll come back at our next meeting with the phase 2 or part 2 draft amendments. So that's going to be the language related to middle housing land divisions, some additional or revised optional language related to some of the things we talked about tonight. And then we'll meet with you. We're scheduled to meet on the 9th. So that's coming up pretty soon because we had to bump this meeting to accommodate my vacation. So thank you. Appreciate that. So I was out last week. So it's coming up pretty quick, but we were already kind of working on all that stuff. So we should be fine. We'll have a good opportunity to kind of talk through stuff with Shane and Dina between now and then. So we'll be back in front of you on the 9th. And then after that, we'll prepare a combined set of, this says, draft final. I call them a little bit pre-draft final because we'll have one more work session with y'all to review that before we then go through the hearings process. So that's kind of where we're headed. We will, just to meet like the DLCD 35-day notice requirements, what we send to DLCD will still be kind of in draft form, which is fine. It's kind of what they expect. It's what happens all the time. But just given that we'll have a work session with you on the 9th and hearing on the 13th, that is kind of 35 days. So we won't have time to make a bunch of changes before we send something to them. But we will have time to make changes before we come back to you for public hearing. So after we have our meeting on March 9th, we will make changes then before we come back for an adoption hearing with y'all and then go to council in the same month. And kind of purposely set ourselves a fairly expeditious timeline so that if we need a second meeting with council, we've still got the time to do that before the June 30th deadline. So that's why we've got the number of meetings we would have had regardless, but we've got a somewhat compressed schedule this spring just to make sure we've got some cushion in there. So, and I should have been speaking into the mic. Sorry about that. So yeah, that's it for us for this. Do you guys have any final questions or anything about next steps?
No, I think I just want to say, Matt and Brandon, thank you. I mean, this is super complex stuff. I think there's a lot of things in here that you drilled down and made a little bit more comprehensive and accessible, which is great. Good job on the survey, and thank you for your time tonight. I know.
Yeah.
Congratulations on beating traffic this time.
Yes, we were here. We were here before the doors were unlocked this time.
That's right.
So
That's right. Must have left at 2:30.
I told Shane and I told Brandon we were not going to be late this time. So.
Yeah. Good job, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shane, you have nothing else to add, right?
I have nothing else to add other than thank you all so much for your hard work. I actually told the city council last night. Make sure to give our planning commissioners hugs or handshakes or whatever's comfortable, because we're in the midst of some really heavy lifting and complex stuff. So I appreciate all of your diligence and looking through, and really just genuinely, some of the stuff that I heard tonight, great critical thinking, really good food for thought for me. So keep that up and we will get through this and hopefully end up with a good product. And other than that, nothing else. But thank you so much for you guys bearing with us.
I just want to thank Deanna, because she's probably doing all the hard work while you're going through all this stuff, right?
Who's on vacation?
Dino's on vacation?
No, Shane.
Oh, well, Shane, yeah. Shane's
You guys
like,
could tell us when you go on vacation so we can go on vacation.
that's right, that's right. Or, take us with, Councilor Duran, anything tonight?
I really don't have much, but I would like to say, something about the outreach that we had. We've got a new community diversity and equity committee that I really hope we can use to get this information out for things like the survey.
Yeah,
I'm hoping that group will, in the future, be able to get to people that don't normally come in
yeah,
on these things. Because a big, thing for me is home ownership. So if we can get these groups that are, not usually served by the information that we're dealing with, and get them involved, and get people towards the home ownership. Some of the stuff that we're dealing with now may allow that.
right.
So I'm hoping that, this is one thing I'm gonna definitely be kind of pushing is let's get all of the functions that the city does, get that into this group to get disseminated out to other people. So I'm hoping that helps. I'm hoping in the future, it really won't help for any of this stuff because it's all real new.
Well, but I think Councilor Duran will help as we move into the public hearing portion and disseminating information out to all possible corners. I think is going to be really helpful. It might mean we're here super late listening to testimony. I mean, that'd be great, but also, yeah, it'd be great. Yeah.
Great, but a bummer, but, if we can get people interested, it will make a huge difference
Right.
in the community.
Right.
One thing that I know that most of the counselors would agree on, and my take on it's a little bit different, but with all of these changes, we'd really like to keep Kaiser feeling like Kaiser. So if we can do that and make things easier for people, and my personal opinion is the more you cram people in together, the less it feels like Kaiser. So that's just my feeling. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be that way, but I look at the dense populations in other cities and see crime and see congestion and things like that I don't want Kaiser to get to. So that's just a feeling I have. I thought this would be a good time to mention that. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Councilor Duran. Council Representative, myself, on the 7th, 2 days before our next meeting, which would be really great because I might get the council wild up about something that doesn't exist. I'm just kidding, I won't do that. All right, any by the ways, last minute attacks? Going once, twice. All right, we will call tonight's meeting adjourned at 8:45. Again, thank you so much, gentlemen. Appreciate it. And Shane, Dina, incredible work.
Thank you.
We are adjourned 8:42.